Good morning, everyone. Welcome to your Vistage Emerging Leader meeting. At a special request of the guys from Spear who heard Barry in the past, I negotiated with Vistage in our corporate office and made the arrangements for him to come and speak to us today. I know this is a topic that many of you are interested in, and Barry is the premier speaker on this topic. He's the author of the book, You're Not the Person That I Hired. Is that the right name? And has spoken on this topic over 1,000 times?
That's correct.
Wow. So he is the expert on this topic, and it was very impressive to me. And I welcome you to New York City.
Thank you very much. Let me just bring up the slide deck and we'll be ready to go. Okay, Mark, I apologize for the last minute notice, but I finally revised my slide deck I've been working on for 10 years that many folks told me was a little bit outdated, and I'm still in the middle of updating it, but I sent that out to you late last night, and I don't know if you'd had a chance to send it out to your members.
I did.
Good. Okay, so everybody should have this. And I'll touch on different points through that. A lot of content in that slide deck. Over the next couple of weeks, I'll be adding a lot more in the speaker notes. And so you'll have a good reference point that you can refer to over and over again. And I'll share that with Mark so he can get those updates out to you. One of the things that Mark indicated is that I've been doing this now for 20 plus years for Vistage, probably done this over 1,000 times. I do about 50 talks a year, 50, 60 talks a year for Vistage, and I do about 10 to 15 talks for trade groups, trade associations, conferences, management team retreats. And so I've, as much as the research I've done, both original and in the context of other research that folks have done, I've also learned an awful lot during that period from Vistage members themselves. And I tend to build up to hurricane speed as I start cycling through this. I'll stop occasionally. I know it's very hard to get engagement, interaction in a Zoom type meeting, but I'm going to stop at different points and try to bring that together. Mark's going to help me in that regard, so that we just don't sit back and watch Barry Deutsch entertain you. And I'm not a very good entertainer, by the way, but I could spew content for 8 hours at a time. So I'm going to try not to do that, because one of my experiences over those 20 years is that we tend to learn as much from each other as me sitting here talking about some of these best practices and specific content. And I guess I'd like to start with a quote from Steve Jobs, who said the secret of his success, the secret of Apple's success, was that they went to exceptional lengths to hire the very best people. He didn't talk about the products. He didn't talk about that they were great designers. He focused on it was about the people. And I would suggest that one of the greatest lessons I've learned in working with Vistage managers, executives, and CEOs over the 20 years is that your ability to hire and retain the very best people you can, to engage your employees, to act like a coach, to get the very best out of them, is the two most powerful things that you can do as a manager. Nothing else even comes remotely close. Yet most companies put very little effort on that. They don't measure it in their managers, and they don't do very much training around it. So you're somewhat fortunate to be going through this and getting this kind of training, because most of your peers in other companies don't get anything close to this. And they struggle along and try to wing it with their life experiences. So I'm going to go through some of the best practices that managers, executives, and CEOs have used to both hire, and we'll touch on, even though it's not the primary focus of our program, we'll touch on some of the issues on how do you get the most out of people? How do you engage them? How do you get them to be as productive as you can? One of the interesting things that's happened in the job market, in the employment market, is we just press the reset button. If any of you were following the Bulio brothers, the ITR economic forecasting folks for Vistage, and Mark, I don't know if you share this with the group occasionally, but right before the COVID crisis, they were predicting the next major economic downturn was going to be around 2030. something akin to the 2008 debacle. Now, in the matter of weeks, we've just completely reset the job market. One of the questions I've been asking many of my clients over the last 4 to 6 years is, you've got someone on your team who's not living up to your expectations, why don't you replace them? And the kind of comments I get back are, it's too hard, it costs too much to get that same person, I can't find that person, the effort doesn't justify it, I'll just suck it up. Maybe they're really good at doing 75% of the work, they suck at the other, 25, 30%, I'll just take that and put it out on my own shoulders. Now that just got reset. Now there's some very good talent out there at a very affordable rate. You're starting to think through the process that if you let some folks go, you furloughed them, you've sent them home, we may have another wave of this if the social distancing and shelter at home doesn't come off till August. One of the questions going through your mind should be, can I use this opportunity to potentially upgrade some of the members of my team? And we'll come back to this when we get to the discussion around performance. One of the things I'm going to suggest and share, and perhaps shock you as we go through this, is almost everything you know about hiring is wrong. And there are a number of mistakes that people make, and they make the same mistakes over and over. And sort of like, Morpheus talked about in the Matrix, maybe they're not outright lies, but we go about it in the wrong way. We're not using best practices, we're winging it on our own personal experiences, and we're going to talk about how we convert some of that to dramatically raise hiring accuracy and perhaps do a little bit better job around it. One of my favorite Dilbert strips is this one where they're talking about hiring, and Dilbert raises the question, well, why doesn't everybody else get successful around hiring? And the basic comment is, it takes a lot of skill. It takes a lot of practice, a lot of knowledge, process, structure, best practices. Maybe some of you are doing pieces and parts of this. We'll explore that as we get into it a little deeper, but it requires an enormous effort. And as I said, most organizations don't put much effort into process improvement, hiring success, metrics, tracking it, managing it. Some of you might be doing this, but we're going to talk about how, as emerging leaders, you can start to take that standard and move that forward in your organization. Somebody has to pick up that ball and move it. Mark, do we have anybody in this group that's in a human resource management job?
I don't know, but I wanted to let you know that Alan Bolio is our keynote speaker next month. I just put that in the chat. And I also wanted to ask you, if people have questions, do you want them to put it in the chat, raise their hand?
Stick it in the chat, and I'll ask Mark to monitor the chat box. And then Mark, just interrupt me at any point, and we'll call on that person and we'll talk through that issue. One of the things I'd like you to do is, as I say outrageous things, as I challenge your assumptions, as I come up with ideas that maybe you're doing some of these, maybe you haven't thought of them, you're doing something entirely different, by all means, I'd love you to share, ask questions. We'll play challenge the speaker. Barry, why do you say that? Where does that come from? And I think that'll make it for a more interesting session. So use the chat box, and Mark will monitor that, and just interrupt me at any point as we're cycling through this. Try to make this as close as we can to a live presentation. Okay, why does hiring fail? There are a number of key reasons why hiring fails. One of the reasons is there's very little interview training going on. There's very few structured training. Most people, their companies don't put them through this. They've never had it before. So how do you actually get good at assessing and evaluating candidates other than, hey, here's someone I'd like you to meet, or you got a hole on your team, now you should start to interview for that job. But nobody took you by the hand and said, here's the 4 steps, here's the 3 things to do here, here's the 2 things here. So that's one of the pieces that we're going to get at today, is how do we do better interviews? Number 2, many of us are using the wrong criteria to judge people against. We focus on things like rapport, chemistry, likability in the interview. Studies reconfirm this. We don't do a good job defining what success looks like. And as a result, we make a lot of errors and mistakes. In a moment, I'm going to share with you a research project that we did about, 15 years ago, titled The Top 10 Mistakes That CEOs and Senior Executives Make in Hiring. This led us down the path of publishing a best-selling book called You're Not the Person I Hired. And it launched us down this direction of doing over, probably 1,000 Vistage talks on this subject. I'm going to walk you through what those 10 mistakes are, but because of that, we make a lot, it contributes to a lot of the hiring mistakes and errors. Studies show that number 3, show that a lot of candidates take jobs for which they thought the job was one thing from the interview, and they realize that's not the job they're doing. In fact, it's so bad of an issue that a couple of years after we wrote that first book, You're Not the Person I Hired, we wrote a second book. And the title of that book was, This Is Not the Position I Accepted. Because so many people at a professional level, at a management level, look at that job and go, this is not the questions they ask, this is not what I thought the job was. That leads to a lot of failure. In fact, studies show that within 6 months of most people being hired, they fail to meet your expectations or the cultural or behavioral expectations. You may not fire them. You may not actually let them go, but they fail to live up to what you set as a standard or as your objectives. And then finally, most studies, and we'll touch on some of these, show that 50 to 70% of your workforce, your teams, are disengaged. They're turned off. They don't like working for you. They don't like your leadership style. They're not being coached. They're not being appreciated. They don't understand what's expected of them. And this leads to extremely low levels of productivity and success. And so some of the things we're going to talk about in hiring overlap easily into the area of how do you engage and get the very best out of folks. We'll talk through what some of those are. Okay, what are those top 10 hiring mistakes? Let me walk you through what the research showed, and then we're going to get into some of these, and I'm going to summarize and group these together. Hiring mistake number 1, inadequate job descriptions. We tend to use a traditional job description that is worthless and meaningless from the perspective of managing and predicting future performance. We have to come up with a better tool. We have to come up with something that shows what is great, outstanding performance and outcomes, and we're going to do a little comical role play around this. Hiring mistake number 2, we conduct superficial interviewing. We ask the 20 standard stupid inane interview questions. We don't get particularly deep. We don't probe and validate every comment, thought, achievement the candidate has shared with us, and as a result, we make a lot of mistakes and errors through the interview process. We come up with inappropriate prerequisites to do the job. We say things like, you must have a minimum of 4 years. You must have a BS degree in some discipline, that are completely irrelevant to whether someone can be successful in your role or not. Number 4, we make snap judgments about people. We use first impressions that we form in the first few minutes of the conversation, and for most hiring managers and executives, we spend the entire rest of the interview validating those first impressions. One of the hardest things to do in interviewing is to remain objective and rational for as long as you can. And it's almost an impossible human task. It's not natural. So we have to use some artificial mechanisms to be able to do that. Hiring mistake number 5. We have a historical bias. We look for certain levels of experience, the length of that experience, how long did you do this? And those tend to be mistakes because we're not focused around how did you move the ball forward? What kind of success did you achieve? How is that comparable to what we need done? We tend to have a performance bias that we look for people who interview well. They make good presentations. We're wowed by the quality of the presentation, so we infer this might be a good person. And nothing could be further from the truth. Sometimes the ones who don't interview particularly well are some of the better candidates. And we'll get into this one in a lot more detail. Hiring mistake number 7. When we go to look for folks, we do very simplistic things like run job descriptions on job boards. We tend to bring the bottom third of the candidate pool to the table. We fish in very shallow waters, but the worst part is we take whatever comes out of that pool of very light networking, running ads, and we consider that to be the candidate pool, the folks who arrived at our doorstep. And the reality is that's less than 10% of the viable candidates, the good folks who could actually do the work you need them to do and be successful in the job. So how do we fish a little deeper? Hiring mistake number 8. There's a complete lack in most interviews of probing questions. We just don't get deep. We take whatever the person said to us in the interview and we accept that as the given truth. Number 9, we tend to ignore candidate needs. We don't focus on their issues of what's important to them. We don't use the interview as a marketing tool. We don't think about and put ourselves in their shoes of what's most important. Is it learning? Is it personal growth? Is it being challenged? So we have a complete lack of thinking about what's their specific needs, what are they looking for, and how do we tailor our interview as a marketing tool around that. And then finally, layered onto all of this is usually by the time we go out and hire, we're desperate. We've interviewed a few folks, the job's been open for a while. All we've seen is everybody else's deadbeats, rejects, retreads, dysfunctional, toxic non-performers. And we reach a point after about 30 days where we actually get desperate, and then we lower our standards, we sub-optimize, and we begin to hire folks who can't get done what we need, because at that point, the hiring focus isn't about hiring an A player, it's about getting a butt in a chair, because getting some work done is better than no work. These are the top 10 hiring mistakes that most CEOs, senior executives, managers tend to make. We've done extensive research on this. This led us to write the book. As I said, You're Not the Person I Hired, with the steps to overcome these items. This is the focus of what we're going to be talking about today. What's interesting,
in any particular order?
these were ranked in terms of the number and frequency of mistakes that an individual made in hiring. Obviously, the number 1 hiring mistake is not having a good definition of what its success is. And I would suggest that is not an issue of just hiring. That's the number 1 mistake that gets made in hiring, in employee engagement and retention, and in performance management. So we're going to spend a good significant amount of time, maybe 30 minutes out of this entire talk today, talking about how do you actually define success? How do you, what framework do you use? How do you characterize it? How do you benchmark it? You'll recall Einstein's definition of insanity. Sometimes it's been attributed to Benjamin Franklin, a few other folks. I kind of like that, that goes back to Einstein. What's that definition? We keep doing the same thing, hoping we'll get different results. One of the things that came out of that research of those top 10 hiring mistakes is not only did hiring managers, executives, and CEOs make those mistakes once, they made them multiple times over and over again, as if sometimes doing it over will get us better results. And so one of the things we've got to realize is, what are the different things that we should be doing? How should we change this process? So some of your CEOs, am I correct, Mark? Some of the CEOs have seen me do my little shtick here of my hiring program before. Many of you may recognize some of these things in your organization if your company or organization has been through this before. Is that a fair statement, Mark?
It is. Anyone that's been a CEO in one of my groups for the last longer than I think 3 or 4 years ago is the last time you talked. So most of your CEOs have seen this presentation.
Okay. So some of them will think, oh, that's what they actually used on me when I got hired. So that it'll be an interesting discussion when we get to that. All right, what I'd like to do is throw this out to the whole group. You can unmute or you can put it into chat. And I want to spend a few minutes talking about what your biggest frustration is around hiring people. What are the things that drive you nuts, makes you crazy, gives you angst, causes you to lose sleep at night? And so one of the things I'm going to do is I'm going to flip out of this presentation for a moment. And let's see if I can effectively do this. I'm going to bring up the whiteboard. Now I got to figure out how to do that from this. Okay, new share. Let me bring up the whiteboard. Here it is. Share. Okay, and I'm just going to write these down as we list these, and then we'll talk about each of them as we're cycling through this. Okay, who would like to go first? Biggest frustration or pain, we'll spend a few minutes around this, that you've experienced in the past, or what you'd like to get out of today's program so you could be better at hiring folks as we go forward. Who'd like to go first on this?
So David said attracting candidates.
Attracting candidates. Okay, so let's take each one of these. I can't
And,
spell.
I asked people what their number one mistake was, and most of them said desperation or historical bias were the top ones there.
Okay, so let's stay on attracting candidates. Let me list these other ones so I don't forget them.
Well, we got a couple of fishing in shallow waters, 1 through 3 of those.
What was the other one?
Historical bias, fishing in
Yeah.
shallow, and desperation was, I
Oh,
think.
desperation, yeah. All right, so with the exception of historical bias, I'll come to that second, the other three all relate to the same thing. So here's the problem that occurs. Think of the hiring process. I don't have a good picture of this right now. It's later in our program. Think of it as a funnel. Okay, put folks into the top of the funnel, put them through an assessment, out they fall. Right before the COVID crisis, we were in most places in this country at 3 to 4% unemployment and headed to 2%. It was one of the greatest unemployment markets ever. There were very few people available. The biggest complaint that companies had was, I can't find people. Okay, and in fact, most of their efforts to find folks brought the bottom third of the candidate to the pool to the table. Now we're at 30 million people in this country unemployed. We're probably somewhere between, given how well the government counts it, we're probably realistically somewhere between 15 and 20% unemployment. The Great Depression of the 30s, the depression level was, the unemployment rate was 25%. We're very close to being back at that stage. In fact, I believe we're really going to exceed it. I think the government is dramatically undercounting the unemployed folks. I mean, if you read any of the news reports, there are still millions of people who can't get through the system to even qualify for unemployment yet. You're going to continue to see those numbers build. If we face a second wave in fall, winter of this COVID disaster, you're going to easily see that number get to 25%. Okay, what's the flip side of that? There are an unbelievable number of people now that are out there that you could attract. And you could attract them at an affordable rate because the entire job market and compensation level of folks just got reset. But here's the problem. The typical way that we go about attracting folks is to take a generic job description and stick it on a generic job board. And it doesn't matter what's going on in the economy, whether we're going straight up, straight down, or sideways, what that brings is the bottom third of the candidate pool to your doorstep. Everybody else is rejects, retreads, dysfunctional, toxic, non-performing deadbeats. So let's paint a scenario now of how desperation hiring occurs. So Katie runs an ad for a role on her team. The job board, whether it's Indeed, ZipRecruiter, LinkedIn, lets you leave it up for 30 days. At the end of 30 days, Katie realizes that of all the people she's seen, none can really get done what she needs. None's an A player. So now she's faced with a tough decision. Do I scrap the whole thing, start all over, run another ad, maybe take another 2 to 4 weeks, or, and this is, probably a politically or I forgot the word, inappropriate way to describe it. Do I pick the tallest pygmy, cross my fingers, and hope I get some kind of success from it? So my question to you is, what would you do if you didn't find the exact right person that you're looking for at the end of 4 weeks by running an ad? Would you sub-optimize and start to pick less qualified folks, the B players, the C players, or would you start the whole thing over again, potentially taking another 2 to 4 weeks? This is where desperation sets in. When we realize all of a sudden, Katie comes to the conclusion, doing this method to attract people, I will probably not see any better people than the ones I've already seen, so I might as well just pick from this group. And I'm going to suggest, and we're going to get into the detail around it, that there are a lot of very good people out there that would want to have a conversation with you. The question is how do you get them to put their hand up and come forward in the process? Remember, Gallup shows that 50 to 70% of most people in jobs are dissatisfied with their role and their company, and they are open to leaving. 50 to 70%. That doesn't mean they're going to answer an ad on a job board. And so one of the things is we got to do a better job of attracting them. And we're going to talk about that as we get into our program.
So Barry, we got a couple more in the chat for your list up here. Creating and maintaining a bench of high quality candidates. Sifting through a candidate saying that we want to what we want to hear versus what they truly mean.
Wait, say that again.
Sifting through, I think deciphering what do they really mean versus are they just telling me what I want to hear.
Who said that? Do you have who posted that?
Amir, do you want to speak up?
Amir, are you potentially suggesting that folks might lie to you? They might misrepresent what they had done. They might embellish or exaggerate it a little bit?
No.
Not at all.
No.
Let me ask you guys this question. Think back of all the people you've interviewed. What percentage of that group do you think outright lied to you, embellished or exaggerated what they did or what they thought they could do for you? What do you guys think that percentage is?
80. But to be a little more clear about my point, I'm speaking about the less experienced person. So, you know, our business is physical therapy, so we hire doctors of PT right out of school often. So they're typically in their mid to late 20s and have limited work experience. So we're trying to ascertain how they're going to be on their first job. So there's not a ton of experience to challenge to get the truth. It's more about, I'll put it into two different buckets just to generalize so you can get my point. Is this person going to be the clinical nerdy type who is going to be really obsessed with patient care and not have the ability to understand that we're in a business and also manage productivity? Or is this person going to be a rock star and do both? You know, and that's where they start to tell you what you want to hear.
Right. So it doesn't matter whether you're hiring folks straight out of college, they're very young, they're 55 years old. I'm going to suggest to you that most managers that I have put through this in 20 years and asked that question of, their response is 100%. They think everybody lies, embellishes, and exaggerates. I'm going to suggest it's somewhere between 120 to 140%. Now you're probably thinking, how does he come up with a number like that? It's because people do it more than once. 14 times on the resume, 17 times on the job application, 32 times in the physical interview, 120 to 140%. And yet the most important thing is we have to get to the truth. Now, when we get to the piece on interviewing, this is going to be our last piece that we do in this presentation, I'm going to show you two simple techniques for which there isn't a candidate on earth can lie, embellish, or make it up. They'll be able to give you specific, precise illustrations and examples and depth and detail and a pattern of those so you can predict what they'll be like you were just saying, Amir, what they'll be like going forward. I save it to the very end so you'll at least stay focused for a couple of, no, I'm just kidding. But I'm going to get to those two things when we get to the back part of our program, and you'll find them to be two of the biggest takeaways out of this entire presentation.
Barry, do you want the rest of the comments people made?
Oh yeah, we're going to get into those in just a second, but this piece about lies, embellishment, and exaggeration, we've got to overcome. The other point I want to make that Amir shared is the really hard part about measuring fresh people, straight out of school, very little work experience, is you have nothing you can wrap your arms around of where they've actually done it somewhere else. It's very hard to predict how well someone out of a school environment is going to perform because you're their first job. In fact, one of the biggest things is you're actually teaching them how to work. And that's why there's so much turnover from those type of hires, is because the only thing we can really measure in those folks is their previous, where they've exhibited comparable behaviors in other environments, like in school, on sports teams, in nonprofit work, and we try to extrapolate what are you going to be like in a real work setting. And sometimes that's very hard to do. And so we have to be even more what I'll say, diligent about defining what are those success characteristics that we're trying to predict upon to try to bring some accuracy to it. We'll come back to this, Amir, with these issues when we get to the point of defining success. All right, Mark, what else?
So two people that work in the physical labor world. Matt has a moving company, and Simon say finding any candidates at all. There's a huge demand for manpower in construction. Construction is not glamorous, even though it pays well. Young people rather work retail, make less than get dirty and make more money. And Matt says, I agree. In the physical labor world, it's very hard to find people who want to work, either in the field or the office. Our location for office doesn't help, and we know that as well.
So it's attracting physical labor.
Yes. Physical laborers.
Laborers. What's your method of attracting these folks? Who posted that?
Matt, go.
Matt, what's your primary method?
So we have put stuff on Indeed before. We've done Craigslist. We try to recruit within, meaning, we tell our people that are already with us, if they know anybody that is willing to work, send them in and we'll interview them and talk with them. And we kind of feel that people are going to not put their neck on the line for someone that they don't trust also. And we try to do an incentivized program as well. We'll give someone a stipend or something if someone we hire meets certain criteria and stays for a certain amount of time. So we've tried different methods. It's just a matter of, people coming fresh out of college or in their 20s, kind of, and I'm generalizing, I understand that, but people in their 20s don't really want to do physical labor work. And then to go to my second point, our office in Brooklyn, we have two, one in Jersey, one in Brooklyn, and our Brooklyn facility is surrounded by sanitation department. So when you walk from the train station to our office, it's not the prettiest thing to be looking at, and it's not the easiest commute to get to either. So we struggle with trying to find people to come in, even into the office, to get better office staff.
So I'm going to suggest a couple of things. One is the method by which you're advertising and recruiting folks might be a complete turnoff for the folks you want. It may not be focused on that candidate pool, because in any community across the country, there are lots of people who actually enjoy physical labor. They like being outside. They like working with their hands. There are thousands, millions of these people. How do you get those folks to put their hand up and come forward? How do you specifically create a campaign to go after those folks? And a lot of times the generic advertising in places like ZipRecruiter and Indeed don't even reach those folks. And so we have to think about, how do we get to that? The other piece you mentioned was referrals. Do you track this as a metric?
We have a small tracking system, but it's nothing that's very detailed.
So take me back over the past 6 months. Of all the people you've hired, of all the people you've hired, what percentage came from a referral?
I would say less than 2%.
That should be 50%. And so one of the things we're going to talk about when we get to our segment on finding better people is, how do we boost our referral rate? Because that should be your dominant method to bring people to your organization. Not advertising, not cold calling, but not posting or broadcasting messages or working on social media. It should be referrals of folks that already love you. And we're going to talk about some techniques of how we boost that. 50% should be our aspirational goal on that one. Mark, anything else?
Yeah, this is similar. Elise says, searching for unicorns, we can't afford the talent we want.
Well, two things. One, you're going to be able to afford that talent now because, as I said, compensation levels in the job market just completely reset itself, especially in the tech space. Just complete reset that we weren't going to see this for 10 years. And now suddenly, in the matter of weeks, the whole job market is suddenly turned on its head. The other piece is, sometimes we put stuff into a job description that really isn't necessary to define success. And it creates this unicorn metaphor that this person doesn't exist on earth. And so we have to be a little more thoughtful of, what are we really defining? Do they really need that skill or that behavior? Do they have to have that background, or can they learn that? And what is it in that role that truly leads to success versus other factors which don't play as big a role? The reason people succeed in jobs is not because of their technical expertise. It's the ability to apply that technical knowledge or their previous experience to what you need done. That is a radically different concept than, quote, having a technical skill. And so we have to think through how we define this, because that changes our ability to bring that person to the table. Is there anything else on the list, Mark?
Yes, Greg says finding the right skills for the job.
And again, we're back to finding. Is it a skill set issue? Is it a behavioral issue? Is it because of our geographic location? It all comes back to how do we get the very best to come to who we are and where we are. And one of the thoughts I'd like you to be thinking about over the next half hour is what's unique about your organization. You know, companies talk about, from a marketing perspective, their USP, their unique selling proposition. Well, what is your unique thing from a working environment? Why would someone want a job on your team? We have to answer that question. Otherwise, it's impossible to attract people. And every one of you has 2 or 3 very compelling reasons why someone would want to come and work on your team, in your organization, and what they're going to get from it, why they're going to matter, what impact they're going to have. We have to get very specific and precise around that. And so, as I said, we're going to do an entire segment as we go through this on how to attract these folks. How about I take one or two more, if there are any?
Yes, Jen wants to know, how do you make sure that there's a cultural fit?
Okay. So let's take a moment and talk about interview accuracy. And then I want to delve into 2 techniques. One is how to improve the interview process itself to measure whether someone could do the job. And then how do we make sure someone's going to be a good cultural fit? So I'm going to go back to, I'm going to close this out, which that didn't work. I'm going to close this out. There. Okay. Now let's resume our slide deck. Let me talk about the accuracy of the interview process, which relates both to determining can someone do the job, and can everybody see this? Is this sharing?
No, we still
No, I have to, sorry, when I get out of the whiteboard, I always forget I have to click to reshare.
All right.
Is that better?
Yep.
Can see that? Okay. So most studies of interviewing, measuring people, whether they're going to be a good fit, whether we should hire them, show that at best, it's about a 50-50 proposition. Sometimes we hire the right person, sometimes we don't. Those studies, the accuracy, the numbers reported, we did our own original research when we did the top 10 study, and it came out to be 56%. Most of it ranges between about 50 to 60% in accuracy levels. One of the questions I've asked CEOs and executives in the Vistage community over 20 years when I do my workshops is, what's your own personal accuracy? Think back, everybody you've personally hired. Of all the people you've hired, what percentage of those folks lived up to or exceeded your expectations, and what percentage missed? The vast majority of CEOs and senior executives of Vistage companies have told me that if they were batting 50-50, they think they were doing a phenomenal job. They all have readily admitted to me that they think their accuracy level is somewhere between 1/3 to 1/4. 1/3 to 1/4. All right, let's be generous. Let's say it's 50-50. Is there any process in your organization where you will accept that level of random variability? Like the payroll checks you wrote, the bills you send to customers. You wouldn't accept it anywhere else. In fact, I'll bet most of your internal processes, you strive for 95 to 98% accuracy. Why then are we willing to accept a 50-50 proposition when it comes to hiring? Like throwing darts at the wall. Why do we accept that? That's not rhetorical, by the way. I'm curious what you all think. Why do most companies accept complete random variability when it comes to hiring people? That we don't treat it like any other process. In fact, in most companies, I'm going to suggest hiring is like the Wild West. It's like gunslingers. It's almost comical the way it's done. Why do we do that?
Because we don't know how to do any better, and we're frustrated and desperate and all those other things you just said.
Now, what's interesting is think about the first comment Mark made. We don't know what to do. That is the number one response that most Vistage CEOs and senior executives tell me of why they haven't improved hiring in their company. They don't know what to do. They don't know what approach to take, how to improve the process, what the best practices are, how to get everybody trained, and how to do a better job. And I'm going to suggest we're going to go through exactly what that is. But here's the challenge to you all. It's not enough for you to go back to your companies and be the only department that's doing this. So the challenge, or the gauntlet I throw down to you, is how do you take what we're doing right now, this program we're going through, and the content you're going to get, and how do you take it back and be the leader that drives it through your organization? Whether you take the entire model I'm going to present to you, you take bits and parts of it, you extend it over multiple years, how do you become the leader that drives more effective hiring in your organization? Okay, so now we've talked a little about why interviews fail. There are two primary reasons that we need to focus on. First is when we're trying to measure whether someone can do the job. Are they going to be a good physical therapist? Are they going to be a good laborer? And the way we go about that is how? We sit and talk to them about doing the work. That's not a measurement of their ability to do the work. That's a conversation about the work. And I'm going to suggest that you need to build into every one of your interviews a show me, don't tell me component. So going forward from today, 1/3 of your interview should be a show me test, a physical representation that they can actually do the work. Let me throw out a few examples of this, and then I'm curious if any of you are actually doing it. Example number 1. You're hiring a bookkeeper in the accounting department. One of the things you're going to assign to this person is to do a monthly bank reconciliation. Instead of talking about doing the bank rec in the interview, put them in an office, give them Excel, hand them your last bank statement, and make them physically reconcile it while you stand over their shoulder. I just got back before the whole COVID thing hit from a client of mine down in Houston. They're a marine welder. 80% of their workforce are marine welders who strap on heavy equipment and weld large steel plates used in the oil and gas, shipping, and marine industries. Their historical interview of a welder, a minimum wage welder, was a 20-minute conversation about welding. Bang, you're hired. And their failure rate was over 50%. They redesigned their entire interview process to be a physical test of welding, where they had the person put the equipment on and use 3 different welding techniques to weld together 3 different types of pieces of metal and shapes and sizes. Their accuracy went right through the ceiling because the interview, this is the key point, the interview resembled doing the job. If you go to our website, impacthiringsolutions.com, you'll see our tagline up in the upper right-hand corner, which says, put the candidate in the job before you hire them. The very best way of doing this is temp work, temp to perm. You get to try people on, you get to see them in the job. You don't have to make a physical commitment to them. And if they don't work out, you cast them aside and you get a different one. The problem with temp to perm, and by the way, there's a lot of people that you may be looking at now that are unemployed. I recommend you do not hire unemployed people. You give them a time period to test them out, whether it's 2 days, a week project, 2 months, but you play with them. You get to see what they're like. They get to see what your organization is like, and you get to decide if there's a potential match. You're under no risk to actually physically hire them permanently. And I recommend not doing it. The problem occurs when you're trying to hire people who already have a job. Now they can't take off a month to play with you. So how do you build into your interview some kind of physical assessment that determines whether they can do the job? And again, 1/3 of your assessment should be this physical test. I'll give you one more example, and then I'm going to throw it out to the group to see what you all are doing. You're hiring a customer service rep. Instead of spending 20 minutes talking about what it's like to be a customer service rep, I'm going to suggest that at least 1/3 of that interview should simply be role plays. You sit on your side of the desk and pick up the imaginary phone. I'll sit on this side, and let's go through the 13 scenarios you're going to face on a daily basis from our customers. That role play, you will learn more about that individual in terms of their level of how to handle stress, calm, how to deal with rejection, how to guide someone, their empathy, sensitivity. You'll learn more about them in the course of that role play than any amount of time asking them the 20 standard stupid inane interview questions that most of us ask that go something like, and many of you use these because this is what you were asked when you got hired. Tell me about yourself. Why are you here today? What do you know about our organization? What are your strengths? What are your weaknesses? Oh, you know what, Barry? We really like people who are able to collaborate and work in teams. How do you feel about teams? And then we add insult to injury, because if we have more than one person meet the candidate, which we always should do, the second person asks the same exact set of questions. So if we bring someone in for a round robin of interviews, maybe at best we collect 20 minutes of real in-depth information. So we're going to talk about what questions we should be asking in the interview. But coming back to this piece, 1/3 of your interview, 1/3 should be a show me, don't tell me. Is anybody in the group doing some kind of physical assessment, not a written test, not a math test, not a knowledge test, but an actual physical assessment of whether they can do the job? Amir, what do you guys do?
Well, so it's a yes and no, and it's also a question. I'm glad you called on me, because it's back to that new grad, right? So we typically pre-COVID would have that person shadow. As a clinician, I can't really put the clinician to work before I hire them. It just doesn't really work that way. You know, there's a rapport they got to establish. It just wouldn't work. Not only that, it's really not a function of can they handle one patient. The area that we fail at is can they handle the requisite volume that our model has, because there are smaller, lower volume types of practices. There's us in the middle, and then there's high volume. So we can't really have them show as much. And that's where I would wonder what kind of questions we can ask so that we feel confident that there's someone who can juggle the volume.
This is perfect. I'm glad you brought this up. So one of the hardest parts of figuring out what this looks like, both the interview questions and the show me test, is what are we trying to measure? So let's talk about this for just a moment. We'll take a little sidebar journey here. The ability to handle the volume is not the issue. What's the issue you're trying to get at? Is it stress? Is it multitasking? Is it pace? What are we trying to measure in someone's ability to be successful in that role?
It's a good
This was
question,
one thing.
Yeah, because not recently, but in the past year, we lost someone to improper fit, just to generalize, and it was stress. Like, this person was a nervous Nelly type who just was overwhelmed and was doing well, but perceived not to be. And no matter how many times we reinforced how well she was doing and praised and told her to relax, it just didn't work. So I think you're right. It was, for her, it was an anxiety, stress, insecurity kind of thing.
So for some people, a high pace, lots of volume, multitasking, an overwhelming number of tasks, that's what they thrive in. They get
Right.
bored when it's one thing after another and it's very linear and it's very slow. Some people absolutely love that and that turns them on. Others, it makes them crazy. It creates so much stress and anxiety, their hair starts to fall out. So the key is, how do we get at that? Now, is there something that we could design as part of this show me piece? And you made a great comment, which is, even if you can't design the test, like it's in the medical field, you can't have them work on patients or customers because they're not yet licensed or qualified to do that. But can you, at a minimum, have them shadow for one full shift, 8 hours, someone in your organization is doing the work so they intimately see what it's like to do the work? I'll give you a good example of this. This one came up recently. I have a client in Chicago that's a cold warehouse storage facility. They were trying to hire someone for the warehouse for the third shift, middle of the night, very few people around. You come to work dressed like you're going on an Arctic expedition. It's unbelievably cold, bitterly cold and uncomfortable. And the concern that they called me about was that they were having people come to work and quit before the day was even over, or the shift was even over. They were just turning in their keys and leaving.
Great.
So I said to them, when are you doing the physical interview and where? And what I learned is they were doing the interview at 3 or 4 o'clock in the middle of the day in a nice, warm, comfortable human resource office. So my first comment was, stop doing that. Conduct the interviews in the middle of the night at 3 or 4 a.m., set up a card table in the warehouse and invite them in and do that interview, and then make sure that when you get the right candidate, they come in for an 8-hour shift and shadow the person who's actually doing that work to see intimately what it's like to do it.
So Barry, I would challenge Amir, because I've been to his physical therapy place, and I would think that you could set up a climate where you take your existing physical therapist, maybe you declare a 2-hour test period, and you guys all become the patients and recreate that environment. You, Lisa, Joe, David, you're all there and you do multitasking. You create the environment to see how they really survive.
Well, here's the deal. Our expectation is not that they're experts at it on day 1 or even month 3, 4, 5, or 6. It's really, can they get there? Because as a junior person coming out of school, we ramp them up slowly because it's not so realistic for them to be rock stars right away. I mean, they're new. So it usually shows up months down the road after you've invested a crap load of time to then realize, or they then realize, man, I thought I could do this, but I can't. And I thought you said earlier, Barry, was interesting with the 8-hour shadow. It's still, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong here, but or challenge me again, but if at the end of the 8-hour day, I'm still left with them telling me, how did it go? How did it feel? Does this feel like something you can do? And they still can give me that BS. Sure, yeah, this is exactly what I'm all about.
You can, but by exposing them to the pace, if they're uncomfortable with that or they don't like it, they're going to run screaming in the other direction.
Right.
They're intimately getting a view. It's not like an hour picture. They're spending half an hour with someone. They're getting to see what it's going to be like to work in that job all day long. So it's one of the biggest problems of a disconnect in hiring is that people don't really have an intimate feel for what it's like to do the work. So now you're giving them that intimate feel. All right, let's come back to your comment. How do we measure whether they can handle this pace? And there's an old adage in hiring that goes something like, past performance is the best indicator of future performance. It's called behavioral interviewing. So if you want someone that can handle high pressure, high volume, a rapid pace, what is it we would look for in things they've done before? High volume, rapid pace, multitasking, lots of things on the plate, an overwhelming number of things to get done.
Right.
Can
you show me an example in your past where you worked in an environment where you've had to multitask, juggle a bunch of things, and thrived?
Yeah, where you've worked in an environment, you've participated in a nonprofit. It may have been something around school, something you did as a summer job. Walk me through the pace, the number of tasks, and then you have to judge whether the gap is close enough that they can bridge it, or the gap is so wide, they're never going to be able to bridge it. Otherwise, you're just guessing. You're just throwing darts at the wall. We call this adaptability. One of the key 5 things that we're going to measure in people is, can they adapt from the things they've done in other places to what it's like to work in your environment? I'll talk more about that when I get to interviewing, but that's exactly what we're getting at measuring right now. Okay, there are 3 levels of doing this. Level A is the frontline employee, an individual contributor, frontline worker. It's a field tech, a receiving clerk, a programmer, a developer, an estimator. I'm sorry, it's not at the professional level. It's at where people are schooled. It's the minimum wage folks. Everybody with me on this? And what we're trying to measure there is the application of their skills. If we're hiring people that are going to do soldering, don't just talk about soldering, put them on the electronic bench and make them solder stuff. If they got to weld, put them on the welding bench. If they're going to drive a forklift, give them a forklift driving test. Whatever the job is, give them a physical assessment. If they're digging holes, give them a shovel, take them out with the crew and make them dig holes. And I have yet to meet a Vistage member that can't work through their workers' comp company or their insurance carrier to figure out how to design one of these so that you're protected legally against someone getting hurt or there being a problem. Okay, and by the way, we focused on Amir on this. Is anybody else doing any kind of physical assessments or testing of folks at the front line? Not at professional staff level, but at the front line.
Yeah, we are, because, you know, we're a moving company. So a lot of times for the labor portion, we just hire people and we tell them, we throw them right into a job site and we say, you know, go learn, go ask questions. And we try to put them with senior people so they can learn, and we'll give them, you know, a couple of times a week or 2, whatever it is. And then we'll ask around to see who they've worked with and if they got it or not. So that's kind of our measuring standard for the labor force on the bare minimum level.
Matt, after you do that after you've hired them, or is that part of the interview process?
No, we hire them, and then we'll tell them, you know, call in for work, and if they decide to call in for work, then we know that they're at least interested in working still, and we'll tell them to go to a job site, and then they go right to work.
So is this sort of like a probationary period?
Yes
where you're
and no.
measuring them to determine? Yeah.
We have a lot of transient workers. So a guy can show up for work one day and then never show up again, or he can stick around for 5, 10, 15 years. You know, we just don't know.
Okay. Anybody else? All right. So keep in mind that as you hire for your teams, 1/3 of your interview should be some kind of physical test. Now we come to level B. This is the professional staff jobs. Accountants, marketing analysts, folks, nurses, clinical staff, physical therapists, developers, estimators. The biggest part of these jobs sometimes is thinking, critical thinking skills, problem solving, coming up with recommendations of how to do things. And so one of the best ways to measure this is through case studies and role play. I like to hand these folks the pen in the middle of the interview and just say, why don't you go up to the whiteboard and walk us through that? What was your solution? How did you come up with that? What assumptions did you make? What kind of recommendations came out of it? If you look back on that, how would you do it differently? You know, if you were here 2 years ago, or if you were here 6 months ago, this came up and we had to solve it, we would have assigned you to it. How would you have set it up? And then for folks at a management and executive level, department head level, we recommend, this is level C, who are actually overseeing teams and functional categories, sales, operations, finance, HR. We give them a homework assignment of one of the results that we've identified they have to solve, and we just accelerate it right into the interview. We ask them to come in and make a formal presentation of how would you do this? And so the next time one of your peers, there's a role open, I urge you to recommend to the interview committee, let's give them a homework. Let's have them come in and present how they would actually reduce costs, improve quality, raise sales, penetrate customers deeper, come up with more products and services. Ask them to actually prove that they can do that in a formal presentation environment. 3 different ways of getting at that 1/3 of validating they could do the job. Okay, so that's the piece about measuring competency, whether they can actually physically do the work. Let me tackle one more piece on making sure someone's a good cultural fit. Then we'll take a little break. I think Mark mentioned we're going to have a calisthenic break, a stretch break, and then we'll come back and we'll start to get into the detail of how we actually walk through a structured process to hire the very best. So you sit in an interview. The question becomes, who's behind the mask? Who's the real person? So let me pose this question to you. When you sit in an interview and you ask people questions, how many of you, by a show of hands, believe that the persona that comes across, how that person interacts, what they say, their vocal tone, style, body language, everything that makes up who they are as a person, how many of you believe that's exactly what they'll be like when they show up for work on their first day? Okay, I didn't see any hands go up. I've asked that question over 1,000 times in my workshops, and not one person in 20 years has ever put their hand up. So if that's not their real personality, that's not their real style and behavior, what the heck is that? What are we observing? The picture should be a giveaway. What are we observing when we sit and talk to folks if that's not who they really are?
False persona.
What industry segment focuses on creating this false persona? Please don't say sales. What industry segment, this is the specialty of that industry segment?
Actors.
Acting and actors, right? How many of you have ever interviewed a great actor or actress? They said all the right things to you in the interview. You were wowed by the warmth and energy and enthusiasm. You hired the person and 2 weeks later, face plant. They didn't work out. Who's ever had that experience? That's how we got the title of this program, basically. We asked our clients 20 years ago, what's your biggest problem? And the phrase we heard back was, I keep hiring people who don't turn out to be what I thought. How about the opposite of that? How many of you have ever met a candidate in the interview who was quiet, shy, reserved, cautious, uncomfortable, nervous, uptight, introverted? You saw some spark, you decided to take a risk, and lo and behold, they actually turned out to be one of your better employees. Show of hands, who's ever had that experience? How is this possible? How is it possible that there is such a dichotomy between the way people interview on one hand and their actual on-the-job performance on the other? How can there be such a dichotomy between those two things? I guess I should differentiate between rhetorical questions and where I'm actually soliciting comments back from you all. Anybody have a thought as to how that can be? Look, my partner and I have studied interviewing to an unbelievable depth and granularity level. We're convinced, we've probably done 1,000 executive searches in 20 years and probably interviewed over 250,000 people, worked with thousands of companies in hiring process improvement. We're convinced that in most organizations, there is a complete lack of correlation between the way people interview and what they actually do on the job. Isn't that frightening, considering that interviewing is our primary method to try to get at it? A complete lack of correlation. What most studies of interviewing show is that 85% or more of the decision to hire people has absolutely nothing to do with competency, capability, achievement, or performance. It's based on rapport, chemistry, and likability. And we've already just mentioned that that's not even the person's real persona or personality. Now you can start to see how mistakes begin to abound in the interview process. So the question is, how do you get behind the mask? How do you figure out who the real person is? I'm going to suggest that in a typical interview that lasts from 20 minutes to an hour, it is impossible to figure this out. The reason executive hiring is so much more accurate is that we spend a lot of time with more senior folks. We might spend 10 to 15 hours with the final candidate. We'll meet them in 3 rounds of interviews. Each interview round will go 2 to 3 hours. We'll play a round of golf. We'll go to a trade show together. We'll get on an airplane. We'll spend a couple of meals. We'll really get to know that person. But at staff level hiring, you don't do that. The interview process is somewhere between 1 to 2 hours max. And anything short of 4 to 5 hours in an interview, it's impossible to figure out who someone really is. It's playing closet psychologist. You're just guessing and extrapolating based on the way people came across in the interview. And so a shortcut or short circuit to that is, from this point forward, every single time you're ready to hire someone, you should not hire them until you put them through some form of a personality assessment. Is anybody using these now in their organization?
Ariana does.
Who?
Ariana.
Ariana,
Yeah, we use
what do
the
you
DISC assessments, but
Yes.
it's not really an indicator. Like, we're not going to hire someone based off the results, but we do use them.
So I'm confused by what you just said. So you get the result back. Do you ignore the output and the report and then hire them anyway if you like them?
So I'm not the person that really is involved with this process. I just know that at least we tell people that we will not hire them based on their results. But it does indicate sometimes whether or not maybe they would be a good fit for their manager. So I'm not 100% sure, but we do use them.
I'm glad she mentioned this. At the end of the day, here's the problem. You can't delegate any of this to other people in the organization. You can't delegate the hiring of folks from your team to folks in HR, to people who might, someone in the training department. This is your personal success. Every single person you hire, the ability of your team to deliver results and function as a high-performing team is on your shoulders. And so if you're using personality tests, you have to become an expert in how that test is used to get at whether the person's going to be successful. So I'm very glad you just said that. Okay. The other thing is, when desperation hiring sets in, we want to get the job filled. We're doing things at the end of the hiring process like personality assessments, reference checks, background checks, and something negative comes back. What do we do with that negative piece of data?
Make a
What would
decision.
most of us do?
Based
We ignore it. We're like, that's okay that they got convicted a few years ago of grand auto theft. Maybe they've grown out of that. Because we want to hire them so desperately. So if you're going to start using some of these different tools, like we'll talk about reference checks, personality assessments, doing background checks, and you get a negative piece of data, you better hunt that thing down to figure out what it is or walk away from the person. And usually what you're going to see is a pattern of problems when you start wrapping around the interview process some of these different pieces. All right, so you use the DISC. The DISC itself or one of the variations of it?
we have a partnership with Success Insights, not
Okay.
TTI.
Yep.
Yep.
The DISC is the most common one that most companies use. I'm convinced the reason the DISC is used, and I don't think it's a particularly good test because it's so superficial, but the reason it gets used is it's very simple to administer. It takes the candidate 5 minutes to check off the words that best describe them, check off the words that other people use to describe them, stick them all in a computer program, outspits 12 to 15 pages of structured paragraphs, and they're cheap. The average cost works out to about $50 to $100 a test versus the more rigorous assessments, which are $300 to $500 per person. But they're night and day differences.
Predictive Index.
That's a DISC variation.
Got it.
Okay. Predictive Index, success factors, culture index, Look, and Mark probably knows this, there are probably a dozen Vistage speakers who have all come up with their own variation of the DISC. The most popular DISC tool in the Vistage community is Predictive Index. And they actually do a pretty darn good job of this. They're owned by a Vistage member out of Boston.
Yep.
And they sell it through local franchisees. You got to take it with a little bit of grain of salt. It's about 70% accurate. I usually recommend a more rigorous assessment that costs a little bit more money, like the 16PF assessment that's administered by a resource out here on the West Coast. Calipers, which is out of Princeton, New Jersey. But these get a little deeper. These are like 100 questions. They're taken in an online format. There's a logic and rational piece built into it. Problem solving skills. But at a very minimum, you should be doing the DISC. As I said to Mark, Mark, there's a dozen Vistage speakers. There's that one where you get a red, blue, or green dot that indicates what quadrant you're in. There's, people are using lots of metaphors. There's a new Vistage speaker that are using bird metaphors. You're an eagle, a sparrow, a hawk. It's almost comical. There's a lot of quackery. Get it? That's a little joke. Can't see your facial expressions laughing. But I recommend you research these. Maybe you get someone in your company, if you're not using them, to actually take the test and see what the data output looks like, because every organization that provides these shows the data in different ways. But at an absolute minimum, no one should get hired until you put them through one of these. It's not a panacea. It doesn't measure whether they're going to be successful in the job. All it measures is what someone's preferred work style and behavior is like in a work setting. That's it. Yet that's a very important piece of data that we typically can't get through in the interview. We just can't penetrate the mask or the fog. And how do we get behind that curtain to see what it's really like? This is a tool that allows you to get there. Any questions or thoughts about using personality assessments? And then we'll take a little break. Let's go back through the questions you raised.
All right, so let's see. Andrea said, won't all the people we get cheap now leave once the market gets better?
Okay, so like any time in rising economic environments, compensation goes up. So you have to constantly be taking a pulse on what the current compensation levels are. And one of the problems of the last couple of years is that compensation was moving up fairly dramatically every 6 months. That's not going to happen for a number of years. I mean, if you're watching any of the news forecasts, this isn't going to go away in June. We're going to be stuck with some form of coronavirus in this country until they get a vaccine in place. And from my personal perspective, we're not going to have a vaccine in September. It's going to be a while, and then it's going to be a while before we inoculate the US, then the thing's going to mutate, then they're going to have to come up with, it's here to stay, and our whole world is going to change as a result. The economic market is going to be radically different for the next couple of years for the job market. You don't have to worry that folks aren't going to jump and leave ship right away. But my caveat is, over time, you just need to be monitoring what's going on compensation-wise so you don't start losing people to competitors or other jobs where that rate has started to come back up. What was the other question?
That one was from Elise. How do we measure high-pressure work environment for luxury clients?
So it was the same kind of question that Amir had, which is, how do you measure? We have a very unique culture environment. We have a certain pace and energy level. How do we make sure people are going to adapt to that? And one of the 5 most important things to measure, and we're going to get into each one of these, but one of the 5 things is, can the individual adapt from the environments they've come from? So if all they've ever worked in are low stress, quiet, relaxed, comfortable, non-anxiety producing kinds of environments, and then suddenly you stick them in that new environment that's radically different, the failure rate is through the ceiling. They may or may not survive. So one of the things we want to look for when we're interviewing people is, and they're telling us what they did and how they did it, is what's the underlying context of what that work environment is like? What was the pace, the energy, multitasking, the level of pressure, the rigor, what they were held accountable to, how fast the change was in the organization, and what's the pattern of that, and how closely, doesn't have to be exactly the same, but how closely does it align with your environment? The bigger the gap, the higher the risk of failure. For example, Matt hires lots of people who work outside with their hands. It's physical labor. The likelihood of someone going from an office job environment to suddenly being a physical laborer is almost zero. Yet if someone needs a job, they're going to say to Matt whatever they, oh, Matt, it's always been my life's dream to work with my hands and work outside. And if they say it with enough enthusiasm and energy, we fall in love with that person. But the reality is, if they haven't done similar things, again, doesn't have to be exactly the same, but if it's not similar and comparable, then the risk of failure is enormous. The question is whether you want to take on that risk. We'll come back to this when we get into the interview questions. Anything else, Mark, before we jump ahead?
No, I think we can go ahead.
Okay. I mentioned this earlier, but I want to come back to it is, after studying the top 10 hiring mistakes, we've published thousands of hours of content, audio, video, articles. You can see a lot of this on our website. There's a ton of stuff in the Vistage library. The number one problem in hiring is that most managers have no idea what they're doing. They're clueless about how to hire well. They're not bad people. They've just never been taken by the hand and shown what are the best practices. And as I said, now you're going to have this newfound ability. You're going to be really good at doing this. What about your peers who are running other departments and they suck at doing it? If they're involved in the interviews with you, it's not going to help. So the challenge and the question is, how do you, as an emerging leader, take what we're doing today and try to extend that into your entire peer group? All right, let's talk about what do we want to get at, and then how we might start the steps we go through. So the research I mentioned earlier, 50% of hiring fails. 50% of the time. You may not fire the person, but they don't live up to your expectations or what you expect. Sometimes you don't want to go through the pain. You've got egg on your face. You want to try to make it work. You play this imaginary game like, let's give it another 30 days and hope it changes. But the reality is they didn't get there 90 days or 6 months later. Our goal through an application of just a few simple best practices is to move that up into the 85-90% range. Imagine from this day forward that every hire you make on your team, your organization, there's a 90% probability that person will stick, they'll be successful, and they'll live up to your expectations. Would that make a difference? I joke around with Vistage groups. I sometimes tell groups that if you could avoid one bad hire over the next 12 months, based on what we're doing today with each other, just one, you will probably justify whatever the Vistage dues are for this program for the next 3 to 4 years. And we're not talking about doing it with one hire. We're talking about doing it across the board at every single level for any kind of hire. 85 to 90%. The good news is it's extremely simple and easy to get there. The bad news is it requires tremendous discipline and focus to do it the same way every single time and not short circuit the process. The little thing keeps flashing up. Okay, so what do you got in front of you? You got the slide deck, okay, and I'm going to send out a couple of revisions over the next 2 to 4 weeks. I'm always tweaking this, adding content. This can be a great resource and reference tool for you. At the back of your slide deck, the very last page, is a feedback and further information form. I'd like you to fill that out. You can take a picture of it and send me the picture. You can scan it and send it to me. Once I get that, I'm going to send you a number of items. Number one, I'm going to send you a copy of our book. It's in a PDF format, 200 plus pages that go into unbelievable granular detail around every single point we're talking about today. and it follows the same exact format. So if you're the kind of person who likes to get into the research, the detail, the case studies, the charts, the graphs, the examples, plenty of that you can shake a stick at. Number 2, the second to last page in your handout today is a coupon. This coupon I give out to every group I present to. This coupon entitles you to a 1-hour complimentary conversation with moi on anything we cover today. Okay, anything is fair game. Now, the caveat I should lay out is most Vistage members don't exercise their coupon for 7 to 8 years. That's usually when I hear back from a Vistage member, 7 to 8 years after I made a presentation. I'm 61. I'm getting tired of fitting into little airplane seats. If it was up to me, I'd sit in my home office and do remote video presentations all day long. Reality is Vistage probably want me to get back on an airplane in the next couple of months. I don't know if I can keep doing this for how many years. So just as a caveat, you might want to consider using your coupon earlier than 7 to 8 years. I don't know if I'm still going to be there by that time that expires. Number 3, I'm going to send you an audio summary. Mark's recording this whole thing, so you'll have the 2.5 to 3 hour version of this. But I have a 30-minute audio summary that's in soundbite, bullet point, 9 tracks, minute and a half each, that go through every point that we're going through today. But it's like, do this, X this, try this. So Sandra, when you know, she's driving into work, it's 2 months from today, she's listening to her iTunes download that I've given you, and it's like, oh, those are the 3 things Barry suggested I should do. So again, another reinforcement tool to remember what we did today. Why do I put all these things together? What are anybody have a feel for what they say about when you listen to a speaker, how much you retain from it? Most studies show that within 48 hours, you will forget 90% of what we just did. 90%. And so the way to sustain that is through some of these tools and different reinforcing pieces. Number 5, I'm going to set in your book, right after the interview component, I'm sorry, in the handout, there is the most popular tool we've ever created in 20 years. We call it the 8-point matrix. I'm going to get into a little bit of depth about how to use it. I'm going to actually send you the electronic version of it. But for our program today, I have it in printed form in your handout. And then I have 3 other templates that I'm going to identify and send to you that'll help put some structure and rigor around your hiring process, that include both a phone interview template, a reference check template, and what we call the SOAR worksheet for defining success, that in a moment when we get into the success definition, gives you a framework for doing that. So you get all of that in quid pro quo for filling out the little feedback form for me. And as I get that, give me a week or 2, and then you'll start to get all this material and information. Oops, I don't know why that came up. Oh, it cycled back on me. Five simple steps to make hiring a systematic and rigorous process. So let's go through each of these steps. And if you do these 5 things, you can raise hiring accuracy from what is, you know, as I said, the studies show is basically a 50-50 proposition, well into the 80 to 90% range. Number 1, and this is by far the most important piece, we have to define what success looks like. Okay, our traditional process is to use a job description. That doesn't work. And what I'd like to do is exit out of this slide deck. I'm going to bring back the, if I can figure out how to do this, I'm going to bring back the white page, the whiteboard. Bear with me a second. Whiteboard, share. Let's erase this from our previous session. Erase, erase, clear. There we go. Okay, let's talk about what's on a typical job description. And there's about 4 or 5 major buckets. So you guys are used to looking at job descriptions. You've got staff members that work for you. Let's talk about what those look like. Who'd like to go first? What's on a typical job description? What's a key thing?
Just a summary of the job.
What's that?
Just a summary of the job that you're looking for.
Now, I'm not talking about the piece that we're posting. What's the 4 or 5 key buckets? And there's a whole section that I'm not even going to count called admin. And this would include things like a summary of the job, reporting relationships, compensation,
Prerequisites.
requirements for physical activity. But I want to get at what are some of the specifics related to the job. Which one of those?
Prerequisites.
Like what?
You know, degrees, you know,
Okay.
knowledge.
So one of the things you have on typical job descriptions is minimum education, right? We all put that on there. You need a high school degree. You need to have 2 years of college and an associate degree. I'm going to suggest that there is no correlation in most organizations between what we list as minimum education and what people actually do on the job. Zero correlation. Now, I recognize in certain industries, the medical profession, legal, engineering, sometimes there is a minimum educational level related to certifications, licensing, credentialing. But for the vast majority of jobs in most organizations, there is zero correlation. What else is on a typical job description? 4 or 5 key buckets.
Responsibilities.
Yes, in human resource circles, they call this essential job functions. It's the duties, responsibilities, activities, tasks you're going to perform in your job on a day-to-day basis. Okay, what else?
Skills.
Yes, there is a unfurling toilet paper roll of all the skills and knowledge in checkbox format that we'd like you to possess on the first day you show up for work. How many of you put behaviors on your job descriptions? Behaviors and attitudes. Things like shows proactivity, works independently, self-starter, works well with others. Does he sound familiar?
Yes.
Yes.
Minutes before our publishing deadline for You're Not the Person I Hired, we removed one of the chapters from the book. And the title of the chapter was Ambiguous Definitions of Success. Who the heck knows what a multitasker does? But we love to put those kinds of phrases on our job descriptions. Okay, so we have a lot of what we'll call behaviors and attitudes. And then the last thing, which I see on almost every job description, it's like the boilerplate of job descriptions, I call it GIPS and GAW. It stands for good interpersonal skills, gets along with everyone. Plays nice in the sandbox, is a naughty with their peer group, good writer, good communicator. That's the boilerplate of most job descriptions. Okay. When we look at this list, draw a big circle around it. Are we defining high levels of output, deliverables, expectations, performance, and success? Is that what we're defining? What level are we defining instead? Are we, if we're not defining success, what does this job description define as a level of performance?
Barely performing.
We're defining the minimums, we're defining average, we're defining mediocre. Minimum, average, and mediocre. Why do we define jobs in this way and then we publish it? We take that job description and we put it on a job board to attract someone. Why do we tell people what the absolute rock bottom minimum is that we're willing to tolerate so they can keep at their job versus explaining, here's what great success in this role looks like. This is what our best people do. Why don't we do that? Anybody have a thought on why we show the minimum, average, mediocre instead of defining and communicating and sharing what real success is? Any thoughts around this?
We haven't been taught the right way.
Okay, we haven't been taught, but there's an even deeper reason why we do it.
To capture more people,
What's that?
to capture more people, to cast a wider net.
That's the number one answer that most people have given me over 20 years. Barry, if we told the outside world what success in the job looked like, no one probably would apply. So instead, let's dummy it down, make it stupid, set the absolute minimum so we can fill our funnel of applicants with bunches of average, mediocre, and minimally qualified people. Does that sound dysfunctional the way I describe it? That's what goes on in most companies. I'm going to suggest that what we really should be doing is defining the success that we want and then communicating that so we can attract that caliber of person, not the minimum average and mediocre person. Let's come back to our presentation. Okay. Sorry, I have to share my screen first. Everybody see that?
Yes.
Good. I just want to make sure we've got that back. Excuse me, my voice is a little hoarse this morning. Okay, number 2. We have to use a few best practices to find the best people. Running generic job descriptions on generic job boards, as I mentioned earlier, brings the bottom third of the candidate pool to the table. What are some other things we can do? And the primary thing we want to do is to describe work in more compelling terms. And then once we've done that, use creative methods to get that in front of exactly the kind of group we want to hire, whether they're physical therapists, whether they're frontline laborers, whether it's some kind of other role. And so we're going to go through how we actually create a compelling marketing statement. Number 3, we want to get away from asking the 20 standard stupid inane interview questions. We have a methodology we call the 5-question interview that is a Pareto-based interview that gets at 80% of the data you need in these 5 simple questions. We're going to cycle through each of those 5 questions. Now we're finished interviewing candidates. Step 4, here's what typically happens. Is it fair to say that when you interview a candidate for your team, you'll typically introduce this person to one of your peer level managers? That at least 2 people in your organization will get to put eyeballs on the person before they get hired? Is that a fair statement? Everybody agree with that? Head shaking, yep. Okay, so how do you collect that feedback? So let me kind of paint a little picture. So Lisa and Sandra are interviewing Amir. Amir leaves the interview. Lisa and Sandra go out in the hallway, meet up at the proverbial water cooler. Sandra turns to Lisa and asks, what does she ask?
What do you think?
What do you think? Obviously, you guys have done this a few times. What do you think? Let's assume Amir did a phenomenal job in each of Lisa and Sandra's respective interviews. What are the words that the 2 of them are going to use to describe their interaction with Amir in the interview? What are those going to sound like? Those words and phrases.
I liked him. He was great.
I liked him. She seemed great. He seemed fine. Might be a good fit. Seemed to have a lot of energy. Appeared to be positive. Dressed well. Looked sharp. Might fit into our culture. Worthless crap at 40,000 feet. Pure observational kind of stuff in the interview. Nothing about ability to perform in the job or adapt to your organization. And so I'm going to recommend whether you use our tool, we call it the 8-point or 8-level success matrix. You see that back in the back part of your program, right after on slide number, I gotta find it. Where's the matrix? It's on number 66. I'm going to send you the physical version of that you use some kind of structured tool for collecting feedback, as opposed to this informal water cooler chat, like, what did you think of the candidate? that's literally worthless in most organizations. We want to force a rigorous discussion and feedback about what different people felt. One of the ways to do that is you have to have a structured interview. And then finally, we want to take and kind of wrap around this whole process. Actually should have cycled through my slides. Typical job description, fishing in shallow waters. We want to write a component marketing statement. This is kind of what happens with that water cooled discussion. It feels like people playing pin the tail on the donkey. How do we make a decision to an interview? Did you like him? Did you like her? It's almost ridiculous. And so we want to use that tool, a more structured tool, to try to get at that. We talked about interviewing. Instead of using the 20 canned structured interviews, we want to come up with a better set of questions. You know, another one of my Delbert cartoons. You know, we ignore data at the end of the interview process. We don't really get deep around using some of these validation and vetting tools. Whether it's background check, I assume all of you do background checks, right? Anybody not do a background check? Okay. Personality assessments. This is step 5 of the process. Personality assessment, skill testing, intellectual tests to measure cognitive and problem-solving ability, sales aptitude testing if you're hiring salespeople. There's a variety of math tests, skill testing. The more you do, the more reliable your data. You're literally taking some of these validation, vetting, and verification tools and wrapping them around your physical interview to boost the accuracy of what you saw and heard. And the more you do this, the more accurate you are. Anybody remember Ronald Reagan's most famous statement that came from the nuclear disarmament SALT II treaties? What was the statement he made?
Trust but verify.
Trust but verify. Take what you've heard, but then check it out every way from Sunday. You know, what's the personality? What's a quantification tool I could test your math skills with? Do you know how to use this piece of software? There are tons of these tests on the internet. You should be testing everybody extensively, in addition to doing the physical interview. Don't let folks sneak by because you want to get them on the cheap or you think they won't go through the process. But one of the most important pieces is doing a reference check. And so let me spend a moment on this. 3 things that we should be doing to validate, verify, and vet folks. Technique number 1, the physical interview itself and the questions you ask. That's a third of your interview. Number 2, the second third of your interview should be, as we talked about before, some form of physical show me. Testing, personality assessments, the physical tests, the role plays, the situational examples, the homework assignments. And 1/3 of your assessment should be a reference check. It's that important. Most companies do not do reference checking. They throw up their hands, they delegate it to someone else, they throw it out the window because typically there are 2 fundamental problems that stand in their way of getting good reference data. And you must be able to get through this. It should be 1/3 of your evaluation of people. Great people have great references. Deadbeats have terrible references. What are the 2 things that stand in your way of getting decent reference information? Who'd like to go first? Lisa?
Time. I
No.
feel like make the time.
That's not one of them. That's a good one though, but that's not one of them. 2 key things that inhibit our ability to get outstanding reference information.
We don't know if we can trust the reference.
All you get is the fan club. You get all their cheerleaders. So from this day forward, you're never going to accept references from a candidate. You're going to tell the candidate what references you want. I want to talk to your boss from this job. I want to talk to your peer from that job. I want to talk to one of your customers from over here. You're going to tell them exactly the references you want. And the most important references, head and shoulders above any others, is their former bosses and supervisors. No one knows this person's performance ability like the person who supervised them in their previous jobs. Yet many candidates will attempt to give you every excuse under the sun of why they can't give you those names. I'm sorry, I left that job 2 years ago. I didn't track where my boss went. I've transferred 3 times since I joined the company. I don't know. I can't remember the name of my first boss. BS, poor excuses, make them track it down. And if they can't get you those names, that's code talk for put your running shoes on and take off in the other direction. Great people have great references. Their former bosses and supervisors love them. What's problem number 2 of why you can't get a decent reference?
Andreas.
Larry,
What?
none of the companies I've worked so far would allow us to talk to anybody. They would say only HR is giving references.
That's exactly right. Do any of you have a policy like this in your employee handbook where employees aren't allowed to give references? More and more companies are putting this in place. If you have a labor law attorney come in and do a legal liability audit in HR, one of the top 3 things they suggest is immediately stop allowing anyone to give a reference to limit liability. But here's what I've discovered in 30 years. I have yet to meet a CEO, a senior executive, or a manager who won't violate their own company policy for an outstanding, top-notch, great performer, and they'll never violate it for an average, mediocre deadbeat. Just by the fact that you can get great references from former managers, you're 50% of the way there. All right, so let's go through a little structured process on how to do this. And one of the templates that I'm going to send you is a reference check summary that walks you through this. Step 1, you're going to tell the candidate what references you want. I want this boss, this supervisor, this peer, this customer, this vendor. Step 2, you're going to make the candidate do the heavy lifting. I want their home and cell phone numbers, and I want you to set me up for the next 2 to 3 days to call them and find out when the best time for me to talk to them is outside of the office. Since many companies have a formal policy against giving references, they're not going to give you a good reference in the office. They're going to be very constrained, like a turtle, folding back into its shell. But on the commute, at home in the evening, they'll be very open and direct with you. So you want to talk to the reference outside of the office. Get their home and cell phone numbers. Number 3, you're going to take whatever the candidate said to you in the interview, and you're going to reverse engineer it and fling it back at the reference. Sandra, when Elise was working for you, she told me she did X. Can you elaborate upon that? What was the original project? How long did it last? What was the charter? What did you expect from her? How did you measure it? How good a job did she do against it? I don't really care what Sandra's adjectives or adverbs are that she's going to use to describe Elise. I want to know is what Elise told me, is that the truth? Remember, we're in a search for the truth, right? This is what the lawyers do in depositions. They've got 15 pieces of data. They've got 27 documents. Everybody's saying something different. How do we triangulate the information and figure out what really happened? What was the person's behavior? How were they viewed by their peers? How good a job did they do? And so we want to get at that by this piece of doing a deep reference check. Now,
Barry, I have a question about this, if you don't mind.
Go ahead.
So how do you present this in an empathetic way to the potential employee so that they don't feel like they're being interrogated, but they feel like we're doing our work to make sure that they're a cultural fit?
You're talking about the overall process of doing all these things or just the reference checking?
I think the overall process.
Yep. Okay, so here's the counterintuitive idea on hiring. The very best, doesn't matter what level they're at, want to be put through a rigorous process because their only window to judging you as an organization is the process you put them through. And when you hand it to them on a silver platter, it's a 20-minute interview. It's not particularly deep. We ask silly questions. They think it's a ridiculous process. The best ones, they don't want to come and work for you. The average and mediocre ones, they want it handed to them on a silver platter. The very best aren't looking for a job. The very best are looking for an opportunity.
Yeah.
They want to make an impact. And the more rigor you put in the process, the more impressed they are with your organization.
Okay.
Now, let me make kind of step to the side on that one. There is an inflection point on raising, and this is the thing you've got to judge. I'm throwing out 88 different ideas to improve hiring. You're not going to implement all 88 ideas. What's the right number of things to put in place that raise the rigor of your process, allow you to hire better people, but don't make it so cumbersome and bureaucratic that you begin to lose people? Or hiring managers begin to circumvent and cheat because they don't want to go through these steps.
Sure.
Every one of you is going to have a different inflection point in that. And the key is to figure out what can we do that gives us dramatically better results, but again, doesn't turn off people or managers from going through this.
Okay.
So that's what you got to be thinking about as we cycle through this.
Awesome. Thanks.
I'm going to make one last point, Elise, is I think folks get it when you describe to them up front what your process is like, as opposed to dropping it on them as surprises through the process.
Yeah.
Is you tell them, here's what, if you make it successfully through, here's what step 1, step 2, step 3 looks like, and then explain to them how important hiring is to building your organization and your teams. Most of them aren't going to object or get concerned about it at all. In fact, they're going to be impressed by it.
Awesome. Thanks so much.
Okay. From this point forward, there are 3 things that we're going to do. Number 1, we're going to talk about how to define success for the role. Number 2, we're going to talk about how do we attract a better group of people than we get from running ads online, generic job descriptions on generic job boards. And then step 3, we're going to finish up with how do we actually interview and assess people. Okay? So let's jump right into it. 50% of people, this is what the studies show, 50% don't understand what's expected of them. It is the number 1 failure point for hiring and retention, employee engagement. The number 1 failure point. 50% is what the studies show. I think in the Vistage community, it's upwards of 80% of employees who don't understand what their immediate supervisor expects of them. If I work for Elise, I know what my job description says. I know what my duties and responsibilities are as one of her employees. I know what skills I should possess and what knowledge I should have. But I don't really understand, does Elise want me to perform up here, in the middle, down here? It's not written down. It's not quantified. We haven't agreed to it formally, and there's no active feedback loop like a one-to-one for us to continually coach and talk about getting to that level. Okay, so those are some of the things that we're going to cycle through with each other. Let me give you a couple of reference points on this. First, I'm going to send you a copy of our book, You're Not the Person I Hired. It'll come to you in a PDF form. Chapters 5 and 6 are 50 to 60 pages of granular detail on how to define success. We're going to do a little role play with each other as part of this presentation, but if you want to get into the detail, you want to start to apply this, there's a lot of good information in that book. And in fact, that should be the first book on your virtual bookshelf. Obviously, I'm biased. Right behind that should be this second book. If you have not read this, I recommend the second we're done today, you download this book. This is my Bible on engaging employees. It was on the bestseller list for almost a year and a half. Every article that has been written in the last 2 decades about employee happiness, engagement, and satisfaction all ties back to the original research that came out of this book. I saw, Mark, the chat box flash. Did someone have a question or a thought?
I said that was one of my favorite all-time management books. I mean, not only for engaging, but for what successful managers do, because it's not an anecdotal story. It's really based on, I forget how many thousands of people, 80,000 managers that they researched.
It's unbelievable the research that's behind it. 2 of the senior executives of the Gallup polling organization looked at 20 million interviews that Gallup had done over 2 decades, trying to figure out what's an engaged employee. Why is someone engaged? Now, why is that important? Because what Gallup had identified through their research is an engaged employee is someone who shows discretionary effort. They go above and beyond the call of duty. They do more than is asked of them. They're proactive. They show initiative. They anticipate what needs to be done. They're a go-getter. They run through brick walls. They are what many people would call your Pareto employee. They're the person where you get 80% of your results from 20% of your people. They're the group that Jack Welch called the above the line employees. They're the group that should be getting the most attention. Our goal is to try to aspire to hire as many of these people as we can. Will we always be successful with it? No, because it's really hard to do. But we should be aspiring to try to do it every time we have an opening. Okay, everybody with me on this so far? Gallup, in the book, identified 3 categories of employees. First group we just talked about, which is the engaged employee. And every year since they published the book, they update their research. Right before COVID hit, the crisis, they were showing that about 30% of your workforce, so if you have 10 people working for you, that means 3 of them are engaged. 50% of your staff is disengaged. That means that's the group of people who could care less that they're working for you or your company. They're trying to get by doing the absolute minimum necessary so that you'll tolerate them or won't fire them. They're just waiting for the next better thing to come along. They're not putting forth any discretionary effort at all. They're doing the absolute minimum. That's about 50% of your workforce. And then the last category is what they call the actively disengaged. This is the group that's dragging everybody else into the cesspool. They're toxic, they're dysfunctional, they create drama, they're non-performers. This is the group that Jack Welch got in trouble for at GE, just lopping off the bottom of forced rankings for 10 years, and then he finally got sued over it. Right idea, but the mechanics of how he did it probably weren't the best. But we should be following this. If you've got group folks on your team that are in the actively disengaged, you can't move them off the team fast enough. And the goal is to try to take as many of the disengaged folks and get them to become engaged. And of the engaged group, this is the group you should be wrapping your arms around. This is the group that you should be focusing a lot of your attention with, because this is where you're getting the majority of your results from. Does it make sense to everybody, the kind of the way they laid this out? All right, so they identified 12 different things that led to employee engagement. Some of those things were, I have a best friend at work, I have all the right tools to do my job, I respect my boss. But the number one thing that was head and shoulders above the other 11, it was in the number 1 slot, was, do I understand clearly and precisely what my immediate boss expects of my performance? That is the number 1 driver of employee engagement that leads to great effort. And when it's not present and someone on your team doesn't know what you expect of them, their productivity is extremely low. And in fact, I think in most Vistage companies, we're not getting nearly the output and success, productivity, engagement that we need from our workers, because many of them don't understand what's expected of them. Now, I take those other 11 items, and this is my tease to Mark for some time in the next couple of years. I teach a completely different program from this. This one's called You're Not the Person I Hired. My other program is called You're the Person We Want to Keep. And it's a program about retention and employee engagement, where we got to get a lot deeper around these kinds of subjects. I'll share a few additional ideas when we get to the piece on defining what motivates people to leave jobs or join you, but that's really not the focus of today's program. As I mentioned a moment ago, my experience anecdotally, I haven't done any formal research on this, but in the Vistage community, I think at most 20% of staff members on your teams know what's expected of them. 80% of the people don't. 80% don't. And I think it's one of the primary reasons why, as we forced people into a work at home environment, over 75% of most employees feel their employer has blown it in how they've handled their COVID response. They're extremely frustrated. I see it in my friends, I see it in my kids' work jobs, that it's driving them nuts that their boss won't tell them what's expected and what they should be doing. And it becomes an amplified issue when people are out of sight, out of mind. Now, layered on top of that is, I think that less than 10% of all Vistage members have any kind of rigorous process in place for managing success. Whether it's as simple as an Excel spreadsheet that summarizes everybody's success factors and what's expected in the metrics and KPIs, or at the other end of the scale, you're using something like the EOS system to manage, roll this up, and use dashboards to manage it through. Most of it's so loosey-goosey that even when you talk about doing it, it's still not an effective performance management system. Once you start to do this, once you begin to define success and you start working through the other 11 items, the benefits are tremendous. I'm just going to throw out 4 simple survey results that come out of Gallup. There are hundreds of these studies that are out there. Your profit goes up, your productivity goes through the ceiling, your customer engagement and retention doubles, productivity goes up, as I mentioned, and turnover dramatically goes down. All because people understand what you expect from them. If we don't define this, how will we know whether we're hitting the targets we need to hit or we're missing them? How do people know what the target even is? It's almost like a rudderless ship at sea going around in circles. So here's the side question I want to ask. This may sound a little bit cruel or heartless given the environment we're in. But the question I'd like to pose to you is, since we just hit the reset button on the job market, is now the right time to look at a couple of roles on your teams and maybe consider upgrading a few of those where the person in the job is underperforming, or their behavior isn't aligned with what you want in terms of your culture or behavioral norms or values. All of a sudden, 30 million people are available. All of a sudden, compensation levels just went backwards. You can afford these people now, whereas before you couldn't afford them. I don't know if I mentioned this idea of, I'm asking my clients, why aren't you upgrading that underperforming role? And historically, over the last few years, they would say to me, I don't have time, I can't find the person, it's not worth the effort, I'm just going to do part of their job versus what they should be doing. A couple of different points in this. Let me take this last one. This idea that you've got someone working for you that can't do all the elements of your job. So what do you do as a hiring manager, as a manager? You take it off the plate and put it on your shoulders, and you start doing it. So Sandra has 4 people working for her. She picks up 5% of Mark's job, 9% of Paul's job, 7% of Susan's job, 15% of Elisa's job. And before you know it, what Sandra does on a day-to-day basis is 50% of her job is the work her team really should be doing. But because they couldn't do it, she started doing it. Now she can't get her job done because she's spending 50% of her time doing the work her team really should be doing. My question to you is, why do you accept this? While you're thinking of the answer to that, my reference point to this is one of the probably the #1 reprint article for Harvard Business Review. It is the #1 reprint. It has been published in Harvard Business Review 3 times over the last 50 years. Title of the article is "Who's Got the Monkey Now?" or "On Whose Back is the Monkey?" Has anybody read this? This to me is this exact issue. Because we don't define success and we don't hold people accountable to getting that, when they can't do part of their job, your tendency as a young manager is to take that on your shoulders and you do it. And that's the most dysfunctional thing on earth. Instead of forcing them to do it or replacing them or teaching them or coaching them how to get it done, and then after you've done that, realizing they can't do it and replacing them, but taking it on yourself just because you can do it faster, more efficiently, you have the technical expertise that's at a higher level, that's not good management. In fact, that's terrible management. If you have not read this article, I suggest you get a copy of it. The latest reprint was actually published. One of the co-authors was the former head of Vistage Dallas before they sold it to San Diego, as one of the, Bill Onken, of one of the authors on the article. And Mark probably has the reference that he could share with you on that. What's the title of it, Mark? Who's got the monkey now?
I thought it was something like "Get the Monkey Off Your Back."
Oh, I have it. Sorry, see, it's one of my favorite articles right here beside me. Title of the article, last reprinted in November, December 1999. Title of the article was Delegation. Management Time. Who's got the monkey? Outstanding article. I'd urge you to get that. If you don't, just pop me a note and I'll send you the reference for the article.
Or one of you guys Google it and put it in the chat.
There you go. That's a great idea. In my retention workshop, I take the group through a little survey that tries to get at, are you allowing mediocrity to destroy your organization? And I'm going to walk you through this. I'm going to give you the 30-second version of what's about a 15-minute conversation. Here it goes. Question number one is, do you have someone on your team right now that's not living up to your expectations of performance? If we're all being honest, every one of you is going to put your hand up. Okay? You have at least one of these people on your team that's not living up to your expectations. That's actually not the hard question. This next one's the hard question. How long have you known this? So when I do this with groups, my technique is to then go one by one around the table and ask each person how long they've known this person wasn't performing or was a good fit. How long has that been? Okay, whether someone's living up to your expectations. Are they at the poor end or the great end? When I do this, I don't hear responses like, oh, I've known it for 2 weeks. I've known it for 3 weeks. Right before the COVID crisis hit and we stopped traveling as speakers, I was doing a program down in Atlanta for a group. So I start cycling around the room. How long have you known this? First person I ask says 2 years. Second person I ask says 7 years. Third person I ask says 25 years. Everybody in the room giggles and laughs. And then he says, and I'm not even referring to one of my family members in the business. Fourth person I ask says, I've known that they were the wrong person from the day I hired them. And I'm embarrassed to tell you how long that's been. So here's my question. Why do we accept this? Why do we put up with this? Why do we have people on our team that are not capable of getting to where we need them to get to and help the team succeed? Why don't we take action? Anybody have a thought on this? This is rampant at every level of management. So my question is, why do you not take action when you have someone who's not getting you the results you want? Okay, you don't have to answer that. Just keep that in the back of your mind. Next question. So now you've identified this person. You're thinking of someone specific. Do the other members of your team know that individual isn't pulling their own weight? Of course they do. How many of you have ever let someone go after a long, protracted period of weak performance or toxic behavior, and the rest of your team came to you? Or maybe you did this with your boss. And the team said, what did the team say at this point?
What took you so long?
What took you so long? Given the fact that everybody else on the team knows this is going on, that Bob isn't pulling his own weight, he's getting little butter pats on the back every year, merit increases, but is doing 70, 75% of the job and isn't working quite as hard as everybody else, What are the words the rest of your team uses behind your back to describe you as their leader when they see this going on? Weak, mild, milquetoast, useless, non-confrontational, terrible manager. Number one reason why people leave jobs is for a lack of opportunity. We're going to talk more about that. They're not learning, they're not growing, they don't feel they matter, they're not becoming something better. The number two reason why people leave jobs is they fire their boss. They don't want to work for that person anymore. And it's because that person isn't a good manager. They're not a good coach. They don't set expectations. They don't convey good trust. They're not helping people to be successful. Number two reason why people leave jobs is the manager itself. Last question in the survey. So you have this person, I saw everybody nodding their head, they have at least one of these people on their team. Do you have a written plan in place of what you're going to do to improve that person's performance? Do you have a 90-day personal improvement plan laid out? Are you going to send them to charm school? Are you going to send them to Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People? Are you going to hold them accountable to hit certain goals, outcomes, or metrics? And then at the end of 90 days, is there an agreement that if they don't move up to that level, you're going to separate from them? Or, and this is what goes on in most organizations, are you playing the mental head game of let's give it another 30 days? Let's see if it gets better in 30 days, except now it's 2 years later. I alluded to this earlier in our program, this idea of having team members that aren't as successful as they should be and allowing them to stay on the team. The quality of your team is your glass ceiling as a manager. And if you allow, like you know, the TV what's it called, Survivor, you know, if you allow people to stay on the island that should be voted off the island, it harms your career. It affects your bonus. It affects your career trajectory. And because you can't get it done as a manager by yourself, you're dependent on your team, it reflects on your performance. Something to think about. This issue of defining success is as important for hiring, but it's probably even more important for your existing team. Couple of reference points. First, the most iconic book in the Vistage community is a book called The 5 Dysfunctions of the Team. I would say that almost every CEO in Vistage has read this book and cherishes it. Mark, has the members of your group done any work around this? Have you done any kind of like lunch and learn kind of programs with them?
Not only have we done work on it, had speakers on it, but Patrick himself gave a presentation. It's a webinar available to all of you on my Vistage maybe 3 weeks ago on how the 5 dysfunctions are showing up during the COVID crisis and what you can do about it.
Outstanding book, outstanding webinar if you've not had a chance to listen to it yet. You'll recall in the very beginning of the book, Patrick Lencioni talks about how one of the key dysfunctions was that the team did not have good role clarification. Each member of the team didn't understand what they were supposed to achieve. There were no metrics to measure it by. The yardstick was loose at best, and the CEO became the bottleneck to getting everything done because no one understood what they were being held accountable to. Okay? So a big part of the book was talking about how do you define success and define outcomes for people. All right, now let's jump to the very last chapter. If you remember from the book, Patrick Lencioni described the nirvana. I don't think he used that word, but I call it. The nirvana of performance management was when every member of the team knew exactly what was expected of them, and the team started to self-manage themselves without having to go through the CEO as the bottleneck, because they knew what they had to do and they knew what their peers were being measured against. And so they challenged each other and they created a high performance environment where they themselves were self-managing what the team was doing, not the boss controlling everything in a 1970s command and control kind of structure. outstanding book. It's probably my favorite book, and that's why I think it's one of the iconic books in the Vistage community. Anybody have a thought or comment around this?
I was just going to say it's 11:17. Do you think we could ask like Lisa to give us a little stretch break here for our necks and our shoulders?
All right, continuing on. 2 years ago, Patrick Lencioni wrote another book. I recommend as managers who are hiring folks at the front line, you get a copy of this. He originally launched the book with the title, The Three Signs of a Miserable Job. He immediately took the book off the market and retitled it. I don't know if he got advice that it wasn't a great title. He didn't change any of the content. He just changed the title. And now it's called The Truth About Employee Engagement. And he uses three fables of stories in his usual storytelling. I think he picks a retail job, a restaurant job, and I want to say a factory role. And he talks about why people think their job is miserable. 1/3 of the book is dedicated to employees describing their work as miserable because they don't understand what their boss wants from them. And that's extremely painful to work in an environment where you don't know what the measurement stick is, how it's being measured, how it's being evaluated, and what you're trying to aspire to. It doesn't matter whether you're 13 or 14 years old or you're 55, it's the exact same issue. I learned this as a hard issue as a high school girls basketball coach. I've been coaching high school girls basketball now for about 12 years, 13, 14-year-old girls. And one of the things I realized probably in my second year of coaching is young girls do not want to hear things like work harder, think smarter, be more efficient. They want to know, what is the goal? What are you measuring me against? What do you want me to do? They want to hear things like, you must get 5 rebounds for every 15 minutes you're in the game. You must be able to stop 90% of the girls that you're going against from getting around you with the basketball. They want to know, how am I being measured? What's the evaluation tool? How are you determining it? Why are you bringing me out of the game? And they don't want to hear fluff and BS. And it's the same thing in a work environment. Folks want to know, how are you measuring them? The problem is if we're not measuring outcomes, metrics, KPIs, deliverables, then we're stuck measuring chair time. How long do people sit in front of their computer? And as you probably know, that's a horrific method to determine whether people are being efficient or productive. But the problem is if we don't define it, then we tend to miss our targets, we fall short of the finish line, we fail to execute on our plans. Okay, so here's the process. This is what you would use for every manager role in your organization. Each of you would do this for your jobs. In fact, Mark, I think a great exercise for this group would be to have each person in the group go back and define what their SOAR objectives are over the next few weeks and have a document, whether it's Lisa, it's Andreas, it's Elise, is here's what I'm being held accountable to, and then share that with their CEO or their direct boss.
So
You'll be
that
amazed.
is your assignment for your homework. So do this for their own job?
Your own job, okay? So there are 2 different ways of defining success. This process we call soaring. This is the process you would use for any management level job. And the reason is it links at an execution level what you're trying to achieve as a department head or a team leader back to what the organization is trying to achieve. Does that make sense to everybody? So let me give you a quick example. Let's say you've got a quality department and you've got a quality manager overseeing that department. And quality in your organization is not as high as it should be for some of your competitors. So you're losing business, you're not getting premium accounts, you need to improve quality. That's the situation. That's the problem. It's a business goal or outcome. We got to raise quality, we got to reduce costs, we got to improve marketing, we got to improve the number of leads we're getting on the website. What's the thing we're not getting? And we can either state it positively or negatively. What's the thing that we need to get to so the business can achieve its goals and outcomes? Every one of you has 3 to 6 of these that should be on your plate. In the EOS management model, they call these rocks. They're the core of what's trying to be accomplished. Okay. The O is, what are the obstacles that are preventing you from getting there? Do you not have the right data? Do you not have the right systems? Do you not have enough resources? What are the problems, roadblocks, bottlenecks, obstacles? This is classic process mapping. We're not trying to point fingers at people of why it's not getting done. We're trying to identify what are the reasons we're not getting to where we want to be. And then the most important part of this is the action steps. For each one of the obstacles, we're going to define an action step that knocks that obstacle down. And we want to define it short term, what's got to get done in the next 30 to 90 days. Medium term, what's got to get done 90 days going out 6 months, and long term, 6 months to a year. Every obstacle has an action step to overcome it. The underlying assumption in this model is, if I list the goal that we're trying to get to, whether it's a sales goal, a marketing objective, we're trying to reduce the closing process in the accounting shop from 3 weeks to 10 days, what is the action step to overcome the obstacles that are standing in our way? And then the R is the yardstick or measurement tool that tells us we got there. We take all the R's. For every job, there's usually 6 to 8 of these. We take all the R's, we put them on one page. We call that a success factor snapshot. Everybody with me on this technique? Every management job, this is the process that you would use. Now, why wouldn't you use it for other jobs? The 80 to 90% of the folks on your team, in your organization, are not managers. They're staff. You don't hold them accountable like you guys are being held accountable to business outcomes and results. Instead of measuring in the staff roles outcomes, results, deliverables, how do we hold staff accountable? What's the technique or tool we use to hold an administrative assistant, a receiving clerk on the loading dock, a field tech, a laborer accountable to a performance result?
Attendance.
What's that?
Attendance.
I'm thinking at a next higher level up. Metrics, KPIs, of which attendance is one. Let's skip this slide. Larry Bossidy wrote a book a number of years ago called Execution. One of the things he talked about in this book, and Patrick Lencioni in his webinar alluded to the same idea. When you're having fast growth, it covers a multitude of sins in your organization of not defining success, not having good process, not focusing on costs, because it's just, you don't have time and everything's going along fine. Now we hit a brick wall. Now we're into an era of very slow growth for the next couple of years. It magnifies every single problem and shortcoming. And if you don't address these, it continues to escalate. You can't hide when you no longer have a rising tide of economic expansion. And one of the most important things that you can do as a manager is lay out what those results, expectations, and metrics are. 3 golden rules. Number 1, we want to use substantial obstacles, action, results, that SOAR methodology. I have a worksheet for doing this. I'm going to send you when I get the feedback form back. It's called the SOAR worksheet for defining success. At the staff level, we use a different technique and we call it benchmarking. Every job that you have that works on your team, there are 3 to 4 metrics or KPIs that define what success is. One of those, for example, is attendance. The very best employees have phenomenal attendance, and the week and average ones, sometimes they call in sick, sometimes they don't show up. They try to cheat the system by coming in a little bit late, leaving a little bit early, taking an extra long lunch break. And 3 to 4 related behaviors, 6 to 8 core items. We want to define it, quantify it, put it on a piece of paper, get the employee to sign off on it, and that's what we manage them against. That becomes the central point of doing one-to-ones, performance management, reward and recognitions, and how we drive this whole process forward. Most important part in doing a lot of this is the action plan. What are the steps, the milestones, the outcomes? What's the cascading effects? How does it affect the Gantt charts of projects? Timeframes, quantification. And the thought I'd like you to be thinking about is, what's the difference between someone who does something at an average or mediocre level and someone who does something that's outstanding or great around each one of these? What's the measurement tool of how we're using to track it? What we want to do is define, both at the manager and staff level, what is top quartile outcomes. Not what's average or mediocre, not what's minimum or that we'll tolerate, but what represents top quartile performance that someone would do in a comparable role in a comparable environment. And they should be in writing. Okay, we want to put them all down in writing. This becomes your playbook, your management tool of how you're going to guide people, how you're going to do coaching in the future. Let me give you a quick example at the management level. So a couple of years ago, I'm with a group in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, like you all. They're trying to hire a key management team member, one of your peers, for example, that would oversee sales. And the CEO was in the room, and he defined the job under the crapshoot hiring column. He had a little envelope on which he had written on the back of it, here's the things I'm looking for. Industry experience, the technical degree, skills and knowledge, unfurling toilet paper roll. Then the team, like you all, went into the conference room, spent 3 hours, and emerged with these 4 items. The team went through the SOAR analysis on each one, developing the S, the O, the A, the R, and then they took all the R's and put them on one page. When you look at these 2 columns, does that look like the same job to you? It's a trick question. It's the same job. On the left-hand side, we're defining what the inputs are, which you should have when you show up for work. And on the right-hand side, we're defining the, what are we defining? If the left-hand side is the inputs, what's the right-hand side?
Outputs.
The outputs. Which one is more important? The outputs. There is very little correlation between those inputs on a traditional job description and the outputs of getting those results. And our entire process of hiring, managing, coaching, onboarding should be driven around what the outputs are, not the inputs. One of Patrick Lencioni's most famous quotes is, if you could get everybody rowing in the same direction, your dominance would be unbelievable what you could accomplish. How do we get everybody focused around what we're trying to achieve? How do your goals as a manager of a department, how do those cascade down to each member on your team in terms of what you're holding folks accountable to and what you're trying to get to? I mentioned the idea of doing the KPIs and defining success. And I guess one of my final thoughts to you on this subject would be, if you can't measure it, and this is my personal belief, it's probably, it's impossible to manage it. It's not worth managing. That comes from Deming. It should be aspirational to try to manage, to try to measure every single thing, that at least the core stuff that your employees do. Will you be able to get every one of them to be quantifiable and metric driven? Probably not, but it should be aspirational to try to drive to that. What does success look like for a forklift driver, a therapist, an administrative assistant? How do we measure it? How do we track it? How do we convey to them what success looks like in their job? Did we hit our targets? Are we achieving our action plans? If you're noticing now that you're starting to miss some of these, they're falling through the cracks, things aren't getting done, we're not hitting on all cylinders, we're not as productive as we should be, maybe it's time to take a step backwards and think about, do the folks on our team really understand what they need to do to be successful? One of the best ways that most of my clients have done this, that has forced this rigor, is to create a system for tracking KPIs. The best one I've seen so far is the EOS model. You could also do this in a spreadsheet. But do you have some kind of systematic manner in which you're managing, tracking, quantifying what people are doing, what the goals are that you're trying to get to, and what the steps are to move in those directions. I'll leave you with one final thought on this subject. Now, I noticed because many of you are emerging leaders, you're a little bit younger than I am. You probably have to have a little gray or missing hair to remember this one. But one of the greatest taglines, advertising taglines on television, was Fram oil filters back in the, I don't know, it's probably in the 1970s, where they struck the fear of God into everybody's heart that if you didn't change your engine oil every 3,000 to 5,000 miles, your engine would seize up. And the tagline was, you can either pay me now or pay me later. Same idea. You can either define success up front and get this out of the way, and it takes time to do this, or you could try to pay the price on the back end when you're using a big stick and fear to manage people. And as you've probably learned, managing by fear is not a particularly good strategy. So better to define that success and get that done up front. All right, let's shift to a different topic. Let's shift to finding people. How do we pick that one unique individual who stands out from the crowd? How do we identify who top talent is? Why do they leave their organizations? Why do they move on to new organizations? And one of the things I'd like to do is take just a moment and talk about what I call Management 101. Some of you may recall Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Everybody remember that? Back in the 1940s, 1950s. No one has ever published content that's as valuable as what Maslow talked about of what employees, workers, people need in their job. You'll recall at the very bottom of this pyramid, he talked about people need things like shelter, housing, security, safety. We got to meet those both physical and physiological needs. At the peak of it, he called it self-actualization. That's what the very best want. What does it mean to be self-actualized? You want to learn, you want to grow, you want to have an impact, you want to be respected for what you do, you want to feel like you're making a contribution, you want to get better. We've taken a variation of this capstone and we call it the LIB curve. It stands for learning, impact, and becoming. Learning, impact, and becoming. When that curve begins to slow down for most strong performers, whether they're a custodian or they're a senior executive or somewhere in between, they begin to look. They put one foot out the door, they start to hunt for a new job on the job boards, or they call all their friends and buddies in other companies. What percentage of folks in your organization are doing this in any given month? What do you think that percentage is right now of the number of your team members as a percentage that are actually looking on job boards, talking to their friends in other companies to see if the grass is greener somewhere else than your team? What do you think that percentage is?
50.
50 to 70%. 50 to 70%. The question is, how do you make it so compelling, so powerful, that your team members don't want to think about and realize the grass isn't any greener somewhere else? It's as green as it's going to get right here. One of the very best ways you can do that is by defining success for them and reading a few of those books that I suggested, like First Break All the Rules. But let's shift and talk a little about how do we use this to attract folks to our organization. And the first step is we want to create what's called a compelling marketing statement. This is a radical departure from posting a job description. It has 4 key components. Now, what I've heard from Vistage members over the years is that this one piece is probably the most popular slide in the entire presentation because it changes the group of people at the top of the funnel coming in. It brings a different group of folks than you would normally get by posting a job description. 4 steps. Step number 1, a compelling headline. What is it they teach entry-level copywriters on Madison Avenue? The most important part of writing any kind of copy is the headline, the grabber. Instead of calling the job human resource manager, maybe we should call it chief selection or chief talent officer. Instead of calling the job sales manager, in the middle of the Olympics, When it's hitting people, you know, in the face, maybe we should call it Olympic sales coach. I like to put in the headlines of jobs, current events, pop culture, music, TV, movies, anything that's on the forefront of folks' minds. Let me give you 2 quick examples of this. And I have thousands of these stories, by the way. Let me pose this differently. I have a client. Before the 2008 recession, my small little client, you may have heard of them, Chase Manhattan Bank out in New York. I'm working on a search assignment, and the formal job title of the search assignment is Manager, Mortgage Derivatives Department. Little did I know at the time that this would be the group that would bring the entire US economy to a complete standstill in 2008. I'm almost embarrassed to tell you the story. But right in the middle of the project, the movie comes out. Does anybody remember the movie, A Beautiful Mind? Wildly popular. I take the movie title, convert it into a question mark, and lead with this as the head of my messaging and marketing. Do you have a beautiful mind? The response was extraordinary. Now, why did that work? Because every one of these candidates was a PhD in statistics or quantitative theory. And that appealed to them because they all felt they had a beautiful mind, okay? That resonated with them. Right before the COVID crisis, one of my clients in San Diego called me. They manage high-end resorts, Vistage member, in exotic locations around the world. They're trying to hire a corporate manager of engineering. This job's going to be responsible for ensuring that anything in a guest room works perfectly. Anything mechanical, the toilet flushes perfectly, the lanai doors open up onto the patio without squeaking, and they're trying to leverage technology and different tools and apps to do this effectively within properties and across properties. So now I'm thinking, what's the headline? What's going to appeal to this person? And the one we settled on and came up with is Scotty is looking for his right hand. Now, you'd have to be familiar with the Star Wars movie cycle to understand that. If you missed that by a generational setting, you're going to look at that and go, what the heck are they talking about? But that generated a phenomenal response for them. You can have a lot of fun with it.
Star Trek, not Star Wars.
What did I say, Star Wars? Shame on me. You can have a lot of fun with this. You can make it ironic. You can ask questions. You can link it to your business. You can tie it to movies, music. I would suggest to you that there is a very fine line between compelling, outrageous, bold, and being stupid and silly. What's the worst that could happen? You post something and you don't pull the right group of people, or you pull the wrong group. Who cares? This is guerrilla marketing in its very finest. You're trying to find the set of words that appeal and attract the very best person to the role you're trying to recruit for. Number 2, the very first thing the person should see beyond the title, the headline, is a challenge question. One question that gets at the heart and soul, rips at their soul of why would you pick up stakes, leave your current job, and come to work for us? So let's say Lisa's trying to hire, she oversees the financial department at her company, and she's trying to hire a bookkeeper in the accounting shop, or she's trying to hire an accountant. And she wants someone that's a little more savvy than doing just debits and credits and posting entries. She wants someone that maybe can put a forecast together, do cash flow analysis, maybe a budget for the next year. And so her challenge question here might be something like, tired of being relegated to nothing more than a back office function. And all of a sudden, bookkeepers and financial analysts and accountants who are like, oh, I want to be so much more part of the business I'm in, they're going to jump up and down and go, that's exactly what I've been waiting for. Number 3, most studies show that below the baby boomer group, the X's, the Y's, the millennials, the nexters, I probably left 3 of the groups out, but they want to know, what's your vision? Where are you headed? So if I asked everybody on this call, I went one by one around the table, could all of you articulate in 2 or 3 pithy little sentences what the future looks like in 2 or 3 years. Where are you headed? What are you trying to accomplish? Why is that compelling? And then finally, most importantly, the last piece is, what are the outcomes, metrics, deliverables, goals that we want this person to get to? This is a half a page or 3/4 of a page. We're going to use it for posting the ad, and we're going to use it for our messaging of direct sourcing and referrals. Any questions or thoughts so far? I could take every single slide I've shown you and share with you the inspiration over 20 to 30 years of where it's came from. So now your question might be, Barry, this is such a radically different idea of describing work. Where'd you get the idea? The idea came to me in reading the biography of Edward Shackleton. Does anybody know who Edward Shackleton was? He created, back in the early part of the century, an expedition to go to Antarctica. And the way he attracted folks was to write a challenging, compelling advertisement that basically scared the heck out of you, but it was so compelling and interesting, he had folks lined up around the docks to go on this ship with him to Antarctica. I don't know if anybody remembers this. This is what I have found over 20 years brings a better group of people. To challenge them, to paint a picture, to talk about the reward or recognition that might come from it, to plant them, in their mindset of what it'll be like to do this. It was unbelievable from this little ad how many people he attracted to go on this expedition. Once you've written your compelling marketing statement, now the question is, what do you do with it? And there are 4 best practices. Best practice number 1 is driving employee referrals. Why, as we were talking with Amir a few minutes ago, why do we not get more referrals? Why do we languish around 10 or 20% when your goal should be 50%? Anybody have a thought as to why we don't get more referrals? We don't get more referrals because we don't ask. How do most people discover you have an opening? They're passing by the break room, the coffee pot, they see it posted on the wall behind it, or the person shows up for work scrambling for a phone and desk and like, oh, I didn't know we had that opening. How do we create a culture that drives great people to our organization, both internal referrals and external referrals? That's the communication piece. That's you constantly talking about it. That's you playing, a game like Mark's familiar with and trying to build members of a CEO group called the empty chair game. It's how do we get people thinking about who's the person, what's the persona, what's the profile, where did they come from, and making this a team project. There's a tendency in many companies to look at HR and go, that's not my job as a manager to bring people to the table. My job isn't getting the best to come in. That's HR's job. I would contend that's not HR's job. They're there to help you. They're there to advise and consult. But at the end of the day, it's your job as a team manager, team leader, to find the very best and then attract that group of people. And you and your group know who these people are and how to get to them much better than the HR group. Number 2, online advertising. Instead of posting the job description in the future, we should be posting the compelling marketing statement. Leave it up for 2 weeks. If you haven't pulled the right group of people in 2 weeks, take the thing, rip it down, completely rewrite it. Your first assumption should not be, oh, we're not going to attract anybody that way. Your first assumption should be, whatever we wrote wasn't compelling enough, and give it at least 1 second try. At least give it a second try in redrafting it and seeing if you pull a better candidate. Number 3 and 4, I call this 1 degree of separation. First, we want to think offline. How does this person that we're trying to hire, how do they affiliate with others? Where do they hang out? Where do they go to school? Do they belong to an alumni association? Do they attend any conferences? What kind of things do they read? Do they hang out at the same bus stop on the way to work? What's the thing that ties them together? And then we want to reach into each one of those groups and use our advertising and messaging to get it right in front of them. And then the very last piece is the same concept, but applied online, is LinkedIn. both through groups and individually. When you write a nice, warm, compelling paragraph to someone on LinkedIn, what percentage of folks do you think respond to you? How many will respond from your messages? 50%. When I write a nice little note to Katie that says, "Hi, Katie, I came across your background on LinkedIn. We're trying to hire for, whatever. I see some of the good things that you've done here. Would you be open to spending a couple minutes with me in a phone call networking about this opportunity?" And 50% of the people you send that message to will say, "Sure, let me close my proverbial office door." You do these 4 things, and you will attract more folks than you could possibly handle. You'll fill the top of that funnel with great people. Driving referrals, advertising with a compelling marketing statement, thinking about what groups, organizations, affiliations, how birds flock together, of how they associate with other people who are just like them, and then direct sourcing both in the groups and individually on LinkedIn with highly targeted approaches to get to exactly who you want to talk to. 4 methods to escalate and get to the people that should fill the top of your funnel. Any questions before we do our very last piece? Okay, let's talk about interviewing to wrap up. The hardest thing to do next to defining success, that's the number 1 thing. The second thing is, how do we fight against making a first impression? Anybody have a thought as to how long it takes to make a first impression?
2 minutes.
Some people might say 10 seconds. I heard someone the other day tell me it was nanoseconds. We
2 minutes.
instantly make a first impression. Is anybody looking to fill a role on their team right now? Who's got a job open that they're trying to fill? Anybody? We're not at that stage yet?
No, Catherine.
What's that?
Catherine.
Catherine's got a job?
Yep.
Catherine,
Yes.
what's the job?
Documentation analyst.
Perfect. How long has it been open?
It will be open at the end of this month,
All right, so
potentially
Catherine's
in a
gonna
few
play-
months, depending on situation.
Catherine's going to play along with me, and this job's been open for 30 days at least. How many folks have you physically met? Catherine's met 8 people. None of them have been remotely close to what she's looking for. She's about to meet the 9th candidate. The interview is set for 7 p.m. tonight. Person has a job, lives on the other side of town, can't get there till 7. Catherine has been working at the job for 13 hours. She's played adult daycare with her entire team. She'd like to go home, reboot, start tomorrow all over again. But she's got this 7 p.m. interview that could go for an hour, hour and a half with this documentation specialist. Does she want to be here? Probably not. In walks the candidate. They arrive on time. They're well dressed. They shake your hand firmly. I'm assuming we're past this COVID stuff. Good eye contact. And in the first couple of minutes of the conversation, they're able to utter at least a few complex sentences. What's Catherine thinking?
I want to hire them as quickly as possible.
Yeah, I'm done. I can go home and have dinner. Why do we do this? When we meet someone who we hit it off with, we have great rapport, there's high chemistry, it feels like we're talking to our long-lost cousin. Why does our mind go blank? We toss interviewing out the window and we begin to ask silly questions, or we begin to talk about nonsensical things like, did you catch that soccer game the other day? That have nothing to do with the job. Why do we do this? That's your turn to answer the question. Why do we do this?
Easier?
What's that?
It's easier?
It is a lot easier. When you like people, you tend to give them an easy process. You tend to short circuit the process. When you don't like them for whatever reason, you don't like their facial hair, you don't like their tongue jewelry, the shape of their glasses, their body shape, whatever it is, you tend to exclude them and try to prove they're going to fail. That's why I like phone interviewing as a first step, because it allows me to validate someone's ability without having physically seen them and getting sucked into a first impression. Then when I meet them physically, or I see them in a Skype call, I'm much more objective because I don't really care what they look like. Well, as long as it's professional looking, because I've already validated you're a good person without letting the physical representation of you affect what I think of you. Does it make sense to everybody? All right, let me ask this question. How many of you have actually ever helped a candidate in the interview? Katie asked a great question. The candidate horrifically blows the answer, and without missing a beat, Katie's like, oh, okay, never mind. You could learn that, couldn't you? Because we want the person to get the job. One of the hardest things is to fight this first impression tendency, and the best strategy to overcome it is to have the questions you're going to ask in the interview written down on a piece of paper before you start the interview. That is the #1 best practice I have ever heard in interviewing. Have the questions written down. Don't try to wing the interview. Okay, second thing. Remember earlier in our program, I told you I was going to help you get to the truth in interviewing? You all remember that? What percentage lie, embellish, and exaggerate? 120 to 140%. So here it comes. Might want to write this down. Technique #1. Ask for examples. From this point forward, every time in an interview, the candidate opens their mouth, words spew out, I would like you to have a knee-jerk, visceral, gut-level reaction. And it goes like this. Could you give me an example of that? Could you illustrate that for me? Could you give me a specific? Never again, starting today, allow a candidate to say something that's ambiguous, generic, superficial, at 40,000 foot, or philosophical without literally, boom, asking them for a specific example. You'll be overwhelmed by the quality of data you get when you start asking for examples. And then the second half of that is to probe into the example. Hold that thought, I'll come back to that in a minute. We've developed 5 key predictors of success. I'm not going to go into the detail on each one of these. The chapter in our book, chapters 5 and 6, 40 to 50 pages explaining why it's important, how to measure it, how to evaluate it. I do want to hit on 2 points though. The #1 element, behavior, character trait of success, regardless of the job, is #1. The very best people have tremendous levels of self-motivation and high initiative. They go above and beyond the call of duty. These are the engaged folks. They do more than is asked of them. They go through brick walls. They anticipate what you need. What's the good news? The good news is it is a lifelong trait. You don't wake up at 13, 35, 47, leap out of bed one morning and go, oh, okay, for the rest of my life, I think I'll try to be proactive. You're either wired to be this way or you're not. And when you start asking for examples and illustrations of it in the interview, the ones who have it give you example after example after example versus the others, the other 80% of the population who will struggle to give you anything of substance that represents initiative, proactive work. The second thing I want to mention on this list is #4. This is the success definition. The things that they've done in other environments. Doesn't have to be exactly the same as what you need done, but it should be comparable in quantification. Like we were talking about with Amir at the very beginning. The pace, the energy, the volume, the activity levels, the outcomes, the deliverables. It doesn't have to be the same, but it should be at a comparable level of work. When the gap gets really wide, that's where the risk of failure is in hiring people. Once we know what we're measuring, the questions are actually pretty easy. These 5 core questions should cover 80% of the data you need to make a decision. Notice they're all example-based. Can you give me an example of where you've done this? Now, these 5 questions are important, but they're not nearly as important as this next piece, and we call it the magnifying glass approach to interviewing. It's peeling the onion. It's digging under the rock. The most underutilized skill of most managers in interviewing is to take whatever the candidate said to them, accept it as the given truth, and move on to another line of questioning. And I'm going to suggest that we have to probe into whatever they say. What percentage embellish and exaggerate? 120 to 140%. One way to hold people honest and to get to the truth is to ask 2 or 3 probing questions around who, what, why, where, when, how, and then document what you heard. What was the size of it, the complexity, how long did it last, who else was on the team, when did it actually take place? Document this detail. You don't have to ask 15 different questions to get at whether it was successful. I guarantee it, after you've asked 2 to 3 probing questions, their example will either hang together and you'll realize they did it, they accomplished it, they were involved in it, or it's pure BS and they're trying to pull the wool over your eyes. There is no way, I have never discovered someone who can BS or slide through this without being caught at it. Questions or thoughts? Does it make sense to everybody? Last piece. Remember I mentioned the matrix? So as soon as the interview is over, you want to score the candidate. And what this tool allows you to do is systematically take someone through the interview process, just as we've just gone through with each other, and then score them on a 0 to 3 scale. The value of this tool is not in the scoring. It's in the comparison of scores between you and your peers. It's in the rigorous dialogue and fierce conversation this tool creates. What it really is a communication vehicle for going through the feedback, as opposed to standing at the water cooler saying, so, what'd you think of Bob? Notice one thing on this that's unique. The fit issues, personality, style, cultural, and team fit, notice they're at the very bottom, not at the very beginning, which most people try to get at in an interview. Why do you think they're at the bottom? By the way, each one of these things is equally important. One doesn't stand above the other. There's no overall scoring or ranking. Why do you think personality, style, culture, fit is at the bottom? There's an intentional reason for it.
More subjective?
That's exactly right. When we try to do it at first, it's first impression traits when we know very little about the person. And we make a lot of mistakes and errors. In fact, it could be one of the greatest mistakes we make in interviewing. But after we validated someone's ability to do the job, then probing into, does their personality, style, fit, values, character traits add or subtract from that, forces us to be more objective and rational as we're going through the interview process. And that's the artificial element of forcing you into that mode. The last couple of pages in your handout, I'll leave you with a quote